Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should start, and I want to again apologize for the delay. I've explained that there was a mix-up, and apologies again for that. This afternoon, we meet virtually to engage in a discussion, some debates, and these discussion debates are centered around the theme of the Silver Jubilee of the University of Nairobi. In celebrating the Silver Jubilee at the University of Nairobi, the Department of History and Archaeology decided to hold a webinar as part of these celebrations. The University of Nairobi is an old institution, one of the premier universities in East Africa, and we are happy to engage in discussions that will show and put on record the various developments, the various debates, key developments, particularly in the social sciences and humanities. Today, we are honored to have with us the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic Affairs, Professor Julius Rugengo, who is going to open up this webinar, and to invite the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic Affairs, to open this webinar is our Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Professor Ephraim Wahome, who also is a member of the faculty in the Department of History and Archaeology. I call upon Professor Wahome to give a few remarks as he invites our guest. Professor Wahome, you're welcome.
Thank you, George. I recognize the presence of the Vice Chancellor and all the members who have joined us, and it is an auspicious occasion to have all of you to discuss a topic that is at the heart of this university, and one of the most important topics of the time, that is 50 years. We have been around for 50 years, and we have had challenges, one or two challenges. And the most important is that the 50 years have been dynamic and have led us to where we are right now. Dynamic, more, and cyclic as well. But what we know is that we could broadly divide our history into the era of the 70s, when there was excitement about the formation of a new university. By that time, Kenya was more dependent on the East African University. But with the emergence of the University of Nairobi, there was that excitement about having a university. And going to the university was an in thing. Then we have the 80s when we started realizing some of the challenges that Kenya was facing as a country, and that we are responsible for the formation of the country. The role of a university is not just being in the ivory towers, but also to participate in national activities. And I think the 80s had a lot of that. And that is a period that was also characterized by lots of activism. We know people like Professor Nyang' Nyong'o, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Professor Michere Mugo. Those are the years when they were quite active. And the aim was to ensure that there was some change in the country, and that there was consideration for the poor, that is pro-poor politics. And that continued for some time. And by the time we got to 1990s, our aspiration was on the multi-party politics. And this we achieved by early 1990s. So with multi-party, then we had other challenges that came with them, and we have been grappling with the same. Continuing on, in 1990s, we also had the challenge of structural adjustment policies from the Bretton Woods. And it looks like this had an impact on the university, particularly the students who found themselves out of key resources. We have continued in that line, and what we have now is the building BBI, and the BBI is another issue that is in the fore for the university. There are many other challenges, even looking back at financial resources to maintain the university, and also issues of reform, which may be necessary to take us to the next 50 years. So those are the general issues that the university has been going through, and this particular panel will be delving into it so that we can get some light. And we have competent scholars who will lead us through this process, and I do welcome them. I also welcome Professor Ogengo, who will be opening this particular webinar. And I wish to state that we are lucky to have Professor Ogengo, who is one of the most accomplished scholars in the University of Nairobi and internationally in his field of study. He is also our DVC. He is also our DVC Academic Affairs. So this is the right environment for him. Professor Julius Ogengo is a professor of human anatomy and the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic Affairs, University of Nairobi. He is a medical doctor by profession, specializing in human anatomy. He has a BSc, MBCHB, PhD, MD, and DSc degrees from the University of Nairobi. As an accomplished researcher, Professor Ogengo is renowned for being a prolific author with over 250 scientific publications, which cover diverse areas of his field, including vascular anatomical variations, vascular structure, cardiovascular pathology, neopathology, and stroke, human variability, and general contemporary human health issues. He is also editor-in-chief of the Anatomy Journal of Africa. As a seasoned human anatomy professor, he has authored the dissection manuals and the texts used by undergraduate and postgraduate students. He has also authored the oganatomy.org, one of the best online human anatomy learning platforms. And he has also supervised and mentored thousands of undergraduate and postgraduate students. His former management roles include director of UON Center for Self-Sponsored Programs, MD of UNES, chairman of the Department of Anatomy, and many other roles. He has wide management experience and competencies in strategic frameworks for administration of university education, resource mobilization and management, result-oriented leadership in the management of academic programs. He has also served and continued to serve on a number of boards and also committees that deal with university policy and strategy formulation. He has also served in several community-based leadership positions. He has won several local and international accolades for his excellence in the field of human anatomy. Let me welcome Professor Ogengo to grace this occasion and also to open this particular webinar. Thank you very much, and sorry for all the inconveniences it may have caused you, Professor. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, colleagues, for gracing this great occasion. I note from the very outset that this is organized by the Department of History and Archaeology, and that it's appropriate that you do so because the occasion itself is historical. We've been here 50 years plus, have a history at the commencement, and have participated in building the history ourselves. It's historical because 50 years is half a century. It is also historical because we are doing these things virtually, and we are doing them virtually because of historical events. COVID-19 is indeed a historical pandemic, global in nature. It will be remembered in history for changing the way our lives are organized and the way we conduct our scholarship activities. When I got this invitation, I was attracted by three things: the historical nature, and I have just explained why that's important. History is important because it creates a foundation. From it we learn. From it we avoid silly mistakes, and from it we copy wise choices, and from it we develop the future. We live the present, we develop the future based on the historical occurrences. The second thing that attracted me was trajectory. And the trajectory reminds me of two things. One is movement, and the second is that it is propelled by a force. I quickly realized that the participants, the panelists, all of you are renowned scholars in your own fields. Very eminently so. The history and the things that happened in our history will give you the force. And you move yourselves and provide knowledge, provide information that will move others, that will move systems, that will move institutions. So scholarship itself changes. It will change because of historical knowledge, historical underpinnings. And you are moving to a destiny. The destiny will be dictated by things that have happened in the history of this university. We are a great university. But we are a great university because there are great scholars in the university. World-classness is now defined, among other things, by existence of high concentration of talent. And this talent will come in various forms, including what you do, your creative works, your publications, paper publications, and the meetings you hold, attend, and conduct, such as this one. This is a major pillar in world-classness, a high concentration of talent. And you are the talent. You, the scholars here, very high concentration in the faculty and staff. And from that high concentration will emanate the creative works, the literature. So I see many of you doing different things, and you are going to be speaking about them. And we are going to be speaking about them in historical perspective, the present and the future as the movement evolves. So I considered this extremely appropriate for the moment. Now that we are asking ourselves, what is it we have done over the last 50 years that we did very well that we must continue doing? And what is it that we did not so well that we should avoid? And what are we going to say 50 years from now? Most of us will not be there 50 years from now. But those who will be there will learn from us. What is it they are learning from us? What is it they are learning from the time? So as we sit at these 50 years, there is a 50 years behind us, there's a 50 years ahead of us. This is what the debate is about. This is what the conversation is about. And where there are scholars, scholars are not about concurrence of opinion. Scholars are about discussion points. Scholars are about the divergence. The scholars are about the synthesis and the analysis of the facts, of the data, of the figures that are placed before them. And they are about generating foci of conversation. That which appears not very good today might be the cornerstone tomorrow. And so nobody feels shy about what they are thinking today. This is my opinion. You have another opinion. Another person has another opinion. It is these many opinions that put together to synthesize a thesis that propels organizations such as ours. I therefore would like to recognize, acknowledge, and appreciate all of you for the role you have played. You put this together. You are going to discuss important issues because you are important people. So everybody who participates has a role to play. This platform that we are using, which has been brought to us as it were, but we have accepted by COVID-19. One can see as you are speaking, you can see the reactions of people on the chat. And therefore, it's a very highly participatory forum, somewhat different from what you'd go to a physical conference and you make a presentation, and because you have outstayed your time, only 2 questions or 2 contributions are allowed. This, by its very nature, allows many more people to participate. It gives you the advantage of having it recorded and for reference another time. Colleagues, on behalf of the top management of the University of Nairobi, I would like to welcome you to this webinar. Those of you who are joining from outside Nairobi, outside Kenya, outside Africa, I sincerely welcome you to the University of Nairobi, to this particular meeting, which we value very much as part of our celebrations. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to declare this auspicious session officially open. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gengo, for that very encouraging words. It's really our pleasure and really honored to have the top management participating and opening this webinar. Now, this afternoon, the Department of History and Archaeology put together an interinstitutional group of scholars who are going to talk about the various trajectories that the University of Nairobi has experienced, particularly in the specific disciplines of political science, sociology, history, and literature. Among those who we have put together to address certain specific topics are Dr. Alex Wanjala from the Department of Literature, who's going to speak about the trends and developments in the study of literature at the University of Nairobi. We have Miss Anna Adima from the University of York, the UK, who's going to speak on student writing and mobility, University of East Africa and the regional identity in the 1960s. Professor Musambai Katumanga from the Department of Political Science will speak on where Karl Marx once lived, developments in the study of politics at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Kathleen Anangwe from the Department of Sociology, who speak on the is the crowd still cheering? Trends in sociological studies at the University of Nairobi. And lastly, we're going to have Dr. Kenneth Mbongi, who's chair of the History Department, University of Nairobi, who will speak on the history of history, reflections on the historiographical trends in the historical study at the University of Nairobi. Those will be our speakers, but there will be also discussant to these topics. We have Dr. Jennifer Mushiri, who is chair of the Department of Literature, who will be the discussant on the two topics that Dr. Wanjala and Ms. Adima are going to speak about. And then Dr. Solomon Ouche from the Political Science Department will be the discussant on the topics that Professor Katumanga and Dr. Anangwe are going to address. And lastly, we have Dr. Margaret Gachihi from the Department of History, who will be discussing Dr. Ombongi's paper. I would want to mention that these are accomplished scholars in their own right. They have published widely, and we look forward to their interesting and incisive papers. Each of them is going to speak to us for 15 minutes, and then the discussant is going to have 5 minutes to look at some of the issues they have raised, maybe raise questions, and then we'll move on from there. I would want to suggest that if you have a question, if you have a concern, kindly engage us at the chat. We very much, DVCAA has actually reminded us that this is very interactive. Feel free to write your questions in the chat section. We're going to pick a few of those questions. We'll ask them, and the presenters and discussants will actually reply to them. Without much delay, I would like to call upon Dr. Alex Wanjala to speak to us on the trends and developments in the study of literature at the University of Nairobi, a critical review. Dr. Wanjala, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gona, and thank you very much, our Dean and Professor Ogengo at DVC for, being here with us. I'm honored to be here again with the Department of History to discuss about our past. If I may be allowed, I'd like to share my screen. I hope it works. These technological things, we are still learning about them. As the DVC has told us, these are new age. Okay, it looks like it's going to take too much time, so I'll just make my presentation without using the PowerPoint that I intended to view on the screen. As you've been told, the title of my paper is Trends and Developments in the Study of Literature at the University of Nairobi. I'll just read through the paper directly. Last Saturday, but one, the 24th October 2020, marked an extremely important milestone for the University of Nairobi, although it may not have been observed with any pomp or fanfare. It was the 52nd anniversary of the appearance of a text that I hope has been preserved in our national and university archives as a historical document. The text in question is a memorandum dated 24th October 1968, which appeared in the pigeonholes of staff members of the English department. It was headed "On the Abolition of the English Department" and was signed by Messrs. James Ngugi, Henry Owora Nyumba, and Taban Lolion. To understand the controversial nature of this memo, we should observe that it was neither written nor signed off by James Stewart, the acting head of the English department at the time, as we would expect from such documents, and also that apart from James Ngugi, the other two signatories were not even members of the English department, as they were then working at the cultural wing of the Institute for Development Studies, or IDS. The memorandum was written as a response to, and I quote from Ngugi, the paper presented by the acting head of the English department at the University of Nairobi to the 42nd meeting of the Arts Faculty Board on the 20th September 1968, end of quote. Stewart's faculty presentation was in regard to planned curriculum changes that had been under discussion at the English department ever since 1967. It is instructive to note that Ngugi had only come back to the English department from a sojourn at Leeds University that same year, and therefore could not have been involved in discussions on the suggested changes that would have taken place since the previous year after Stewart's faculty board presentation. The issue was brought back to the department for further discussion, which prompted Ngugi's intervention through the memorandum. The bone of contention, according to the famous trio, was that the changes to the existing curriculum, which were being proposed in order to recognize the fact that Kenya was a post-colonial country, were rather cosmetic, as they were still steeped in placing English traditions at their center, rather than focusing on Africa as a focal point in the understanding of the consciousness and the cultural heritage of East Africa's peoples in the study of literature. Another factor that led to the discontent of the authors of the memo was that the proposed curriculum imposed arbitrary standards, since it required that literary texts that were to be selected for study would have to be of excellent quality. It would seem, therefore, that the trio were disappointed that even with the coming of independence in 1963, there were no efforts being made by the expatriates who now comprise the bulk of the staff members of the English department to decolonize the curriculum. In order to understand these events more keenly, we have to go further back into history in order to interrogate the ideology behind the curriculum being offered by the English department of the University of East Africa. It had been offered through the University of London and had initially been implemented at Makerere University College, even before the establishment of the University of East Africa in 1963. It was steeped in the tradition of the Cambridge School of Criticism, whose leading lights were I.A. Richards and F.R. Leavis. The duo was known for engaging in the methodology of practical criticism of literary texts as a mode of teaching literary criticism. Indeed, I.A. Richards is known to be a member of the School of New Criticism. Although F.R. Leavis did not himself write essays on his cogent philosophical thought, He is known to be the most influential British critic of the 20th century through his work as a professor at Cambridge, his editing of the literary journal Scrutiny for 20 years, and especially for his numerous essays on English literature. F.R. Leavis displayed the influences of T.S. Eliot and Matthew Arnold in his thought and writing. Indeed, F.R. Leavis's ideological concern throughout his career is based on what he perceives as a breach in continuity in terms of a rupture in modern times with tradition, which is a preserve of the past as a result of technological advances and civilization. This thought stems from T.S. Eliot's early critical work in Tradition and the Individual Talent, an essay he wrote in 1920, where he gets the idea of preserving tradition through the continuity of literary thought, and also from another critic, Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy, which is a very famous text that was published in 1869, where Leavis gets the notions of culture being a means of preserving morality in society through critical reflection. After studying these texts, Leavis publishes his first essay entitled Mass Civilization and Minority Culture, that is in 1933. In his essay, Leavis sees the introduction of machines and automation as having brought about changes in habit and circumstances of life at such an unprecedented rate that the delicate process of cultural adjustment has been replaced by improvisation. Thus, the threat in modern society is a breach in continuity that leads to a situation whereby what has been inadvertently dropped may be irrecoverable and forgotten. In regard to literature and language, according to Leavis, by that time, mechanization has led to standardization and mass production in English society. For example, there were numerous book reviews that appeared in the modern day newspapers, meaning that just any book was seen as suitable for discussion as a literary text. This factor led to the diminution of a discerning reading public in English society and the proliferation of book clubs that gave a standard response to literary works, thus creating a situation whereby there are no critical standards. Leavis therefore sees the need for specialization of work in terms of facilitating the discovery of the finest consciousness of the age through art, and sees this as only accessible through the preservation of a minority class of discerning literary critics. In the essay, Leavis also expresses the fear that if attempts to standardize language through the use of basic English should come to pass, the subtlety of the finest idiom of language would be lost, and with it, the culture that depends on it. We therefore perceive in this early essay by Leavis his incipient ideas on the need to preserve a literary tradition in modern times through practical criticism. In another essay, Education and the University, published in 1943, Leavis extends his arguments on the deterioration of society due to technological advancement, as cited above, to argue that it is in the university where these problems that arise through mechanization could be addressed by tapping on the cultivation of intelligence and a mature sense of values in order to propagate the focus on humane consciousness. Thus, the kind of English school with which Leavis wanted to be associated would be suitable for producing the man of humane culture who is equipped to be intelligent and responsible about the problems of contemporary civilization. Because the essential literary critical discipline of the English school trains the intelligence, and at the same time, it trains the sensibility. This is all with the goal of preserving the tradition that is threatened by a breach in continuity, training graduates in the literature of their own language and country, Then, thereafter, appreciating texts in other languages, such as French and Greek in their original versions. By this time, Lewis had already put this thought into practice at Downing College, Cambridge, where, as we have previously mentioned, he taught using the method of practical criticism. The text that Lewis is most famous for, however, is The Great Tradition, which was published in 1948, through which Lewis establishes a literary canon of Western writers that he finds worthy of study. These writers are such as Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad, who Lewis sees as worthy of being representative of a founding tradition in the past, and D.H. Lawrence, who Lewis finds as the only writer from his generation who is worthy enough to provide continuity with that past. It is evident, therefore, that Lewis's critical ideology strives to suspend contemporary or modern culture and thought as a means of the preservation of a tradition that he finds may have been lost due to mechanization of society. And he sees that the means of battling against this loss of continuity is through literature and criticism. Thus, the function of literary criticism, according to Lewisite critical ideology, could be, and I quote, to distinguish the real artist and secure backing for him, to place the uncreative, and to maintain critical standards, end of quote. So this was the critical ideology that must have been carried over from Downing College of Cambridge to Makerere University College through the expatriate lecturers from Cambridge, and was taught to the emergent East African writers and critics such as James Ngugi, Jonathan Kariara, David Rubadiri, Peter Nazareth, Pio and Elvania Zirimo, and Grant Kamenjo, just to name a few, in their undergraduate studies as students in the Department of English. As the emerging East African elite, they were to be trained in a manner that would provide them with a sensibility towards art and culture that adhered to the great tradition. In this manner, their education made them a preserve of the few among society, who would have the ability to read and examine literary texts in a discriminatory manner. They would have been trained in the good use of English language and idiom, and a study of English literature, through which they would appreciate the best that has been taught and said. And in preserving the English literary tradition through their reading and writing, they would battle against a potential loss in continuity that may arise due to historical changes related to decolonization. Hence the desire to continue with the same kind of ideology, even in the post-colonial order, as was suggested in Stewart's proposed curriculum. Having gone through this education, Ngugi was alert to the context, hence his reaction to the situation. But how is it that he arrived at coming up with a different positioning in regard to the critical ideology he was trained in as an undergraduate? This may be attributed to his time at Leeds University that adjusted his intellectual development. As Carol Sicherman divulged in her article, The Leeds Makerere Connection and Ngugi's Intellectual Development, Leeds University is a university with a leftist culture and is located in the proletariat area of the city. It must have been a sharp contrast for Ngugi, arriving from the colonial atmosphere of Makerere University College, to note that class differences existed even within the metropole itself. Ngugi was not alone at Leeds. He was joined by some of his former colleagues from Makerere, such as Grant Kamenju, Pio and Elvania Zirimu, and Peter Nazareth. They were forced to form an African community while at Leeds because of the racial prejudice that existed within the student community during their time there. These factors alone were enough to raise their socialist awareness.
Dr. Angela, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, wow, okay. So I think in this article, I think I've just highlighted how Leeds then picks up, Ngugi picks up his, socialist consciousness from Makerere, together with his colleagues Grant Kamenju and Pio and Elvania Zirimu, who now move on. Ngugi comes back to Nairobi. Pio and Elvania Zirimu go to Makerere, and Grant Kamenju then goes to, he goes to University of Dar es Salaam. But I really wanted to highlight 3 issues that radicalized Ngugi at Leeds University. And this was one, interaction with the left-wing community in Leeds. 2, Grant Kamenju picking up Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth from a shop in Paris. And 3, the teaching of Arnold Kettle, who was a Marxist. He taught Ngugi and actually edited his text, A Grain of Wheat. And therefore, by the time Ngugi comes back to Nairobi, he has shed his critical consciousness. I mean, he has shared that intellectual training that he had at Makerere in the great tradition, and he has picked up a socialist critical consciousness. And therefore, it is then natural that Ngugi, picks up on the decolonization of the curriculum. And this should also be seen as, a war between the Cambridge ideology and the Leeds ideology, because the Cambridge ideology was more elitist and based on the great tradition, while the Leeds ideology was, socialist. And that is what Taban calls, getting rid of the augurs of Cambridge and Oxford in coming up with a new curriculum in the Department of Literature. If you'll allow, Mr. Chair, I'll read through this, because when I start thinking, I skip on a lot of information. Let me just read through the last section. It is evident, therefore, that the ideological battle to decolonize the literature curriculum at the University of Nairobi was a battle against the Cambridge School of Criticism. When Taban talks of the augurs of Cambridge and Oxford, he's not referring to personalities, but a critical ideology that had been perpetuated during colonial times, continued during the period of decolonization, and threatened to be perpetuated even during the post-colonial period. However, it should be noted that the shift was not conclusive, as not everybody was converted into the newly proposed ideological framework. Some of the intellectuals and writers preferred to continue operating within the great Western tradition and continue to do so to this day. The poet Jonathan Kariara, whom Ngugi found at Makerere, is reported to have stated that writing in that tradition makes me positively randy, or something to that effect. I don't know whether the word had the same connotation in his time as it does today, but his statement makes us understand why the tradition exists to date, even at the University of Nairobi. However, the actions by Ngugi and his colleagues were directly responsible for the emergence of African literature as an academic discipline, and therefore, the University of Nairobi marked a first in the world with the establishment of the Department of Literature in 1970. However, with all this phenomenon, the nationalists, there's a critic called Biodun Jaifu, who applauds Ngugi and his colleagues at the University of Nairobi for the document that they produced, which he considers as the most important document of all in terms of laying the principles and foundations of a curricular and disciplinary consolidation of the use of African literature in the schools and universities of independent Africa. He describes them as belonging to the nationalist school. The nature of this school is that it required that the scholar place the truth in the service of national liberation, the construction of a social order that favors the mass of urban workers and rural producers at the base of the socio-economic pyramid in your colonial Africa. In other words, they favored extra literary curricula in the formulation and evaluation of literary texts. The Africanist school, on the other hand, was more interested in objectivity, rigor, formalism, literary forms of evaluation, the structure of the text, and the economy of its effect on readers, just as was practiced by F.R. Leavis. What I mean here is that there emerged two schools in this period of the 1980s. The nationalists had picked up from 1970, Ngugi and the likes, but during the period of political oppression that will be discussed by other presenters, the people who preserved literature went back to the kind of criticism practiced by F.R. Leavis, and these are what are called the Africanist schools. And as J4 tells us, in recent times, Africanists have come to hold sway over the discipline in an especially problematic manner, and their narrowly formulated agenda increasingly dominates perceptions of what is to be done at the present time in the field of African literary studies. This agenda consists primarily of winning respectability for the discipline of African literary study in the developed countries. It means that rather than us being inward looking, we adhere to theories that are imported from abroad. J4 decries the fact that in their zeal to stick to the Western theoretical frameworks, the Africanists who by then ensured the survival of discourse on African literature chose to ignore advances in Western literary theory, such as the relationship between knowledge and power in critical discourse, while still, due to an inequitable capitalist world system, the true center of gravity for the study of African literature was by that time displaced from the African continent.
Dr. Wanjala, you've taken so much time. I think you can conclude.
Allow me to conclude.
Please.
So it is important to note that despite that prevailing situation in Africa, there are still some contributions to critical theory that still emanated from the Department of Literature. And one is that of the growth of a literary tradition in East Africa that has been discussed by Chris Wanjala over the years. And he kind of marries the method of F.R. Leavis with a methodology of reading African traditions that are preserved in our oral literature and our culture. And that way, even during the difficult political turmoil of the 80s, Wanjala identifies and recommends a critical ideology that is a middle ground between that of the nationalist school and the Africanist school. And therefore, the Department of Literature has come a long way since 1970 and has survived strong headwinds during the time of political oppression in Kenya, and has displayed a tenacity that has enabled the survival of the study of literature in the country to date. And due to the diverse nature of critical approaches followed by the academics in the department, it produces well-rounded graduates that are capable of holding their own in the practice of the discipline of literature, no matter where they find themselves. It is a mother department of several other departments in the country and has inspired the decolonization of the curriculum in English departments in several parts of the world, including the University of West Indies, Yale University, and most recently, Cornell University. Here is to another 50 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wanjala. We'll ask the next presenter, Ms. Adima, to go ahead with her presentation. After that, we'll ask Dr. Jennifer Mushiri to give 5 minutes as a discussant, and then we'll allow for a few questions. So kindly write those questions at the chat section. We'll raise them to the discussant and the presenter before we move to the next presenters. Ms. Adima, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thank esteemed professors and everybody who's watching. I'm really very happy to be here. I was actually in Nairobi earlier this year in March, and I and I had every intention of going to the University of Nairobi, but unfortunately because of COVID, my home country was going to close its borders. I'm from Uganda, so I had to rush back home. So nevertheless, I am very happy to be here now, even if it is virtually. So I am Anna Adima, and I am a PhD student at the University of York, where I'm researching the history of women's writing after independence in Uganda and in Kenya. For this webinar, I would like to talk to you about what is more or less intended to be a chapter of my PhD thesis, which is the history of student publications of the University of East Africa in the 1960s. I should add as a caveat that it's very far from perfect, and it's still very much based on ideas that I'm forming in my head post-fieldwork. And also a lot of what I'm saying will be a repetition of what Dr. Wanjala mentioned in his excellent paper earlier, so forgive me in advance. The University of East Africa was a higher education institution serving the countries of Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was known at the time. Established in 1963, it consisted of the University of Makerere, the University of Nairobi, and the University of Dar es Salaam, which were all colleges of the overall university. It was a very ambitious project and intended to promote greater regionalism and student mobility. Intellectual life thrived at all three institutions as new research, especially in the humanities, was happening in the light of the decade of independence. The literature departments at all three universities stood out in particular as they produced student-led publications that contributed to the vibrancy of the East African literary scene in the 1960s. Makerere produced Penpoint, which would later become Dhana. The University of Nairobi published Nexus, which was later renamed Busara, and the University of Dar es Salaam produced Darlight, which would later become Umma. For this webinar, however, I will place an emphasis on the University of Nairobi's literature department in particular, as well as its publications, and I would like to explore how this print culture produced and sustained East African unity and promoted greater East African regional rather than national identifications. So the structure of the paper will be as follows. To begin with, I shall provide some background and context to the University of Nairobi, looking in particular at its literature and English departments. I shall then discuss the publications Nexus and Busara and how their content and contributors promoted East African regionalism. Finally, I shall look at the publications in the 1970s and how networks continued to be sustained in spite of the breakdown of diplomatic relations between East African countries. So beginning with a brief background to the University of Nairobi, which, forgive me, I'm sure it's not required because of all the experts in this virtual room. The University of Nairobi was established later than Makerere College. It was established in 1956 as Royal Technical College, intended to provide vocational training rather than academic education to young men and women. In 1961, it became affiliated with the University of London and was renamed Royal College of Nairobi, and at this point began to offer other subjects, including arts, science, and engineering. The Royal College attracted students from all over East Africa. Indeed, the Ugandan author Violet Barungi, who is one of the authors I'm looking at for my PhD, after finishing her secondary education at the prestigious Gayaza High School for Girls in Uganda, she attended Royal College of Nairobi with other young women from Uganda who studied subjects ranging from fine arts to home economics. After completing what was the then equivalent of A-levels at Royal College Nairobi, many went to Makerere for higher education. Violet Barungi, who studied history at Makerere in the 1960s, she later recalled that there were many familiar faces on the Makerere campus from her days at Royal College, which also demonstrates how relatively small these elite educated circles were at the time. In 1964, 1 year after the creation of the University of East Africa, Royal College became University College Nairobi, and in 1970 it became the University of Nairobi. The University of Nairobi's literature department in the 1960s, while at the time it may not have had the same reputation as that of Makerere in neighboring Uganda, however, from the mid to late 1960s onwards, it began to gain repute across the region and the African continent more broadly. This was largely due to the fact that former Makereans, fresh graduates or otherwise, moved to Kenya and sought work at the University of Nairobi. It was around this time in 1967 that the first student literary publication was established, so Nexus, which would later become Busara. Similar to Penpoint and Dhana at Makerere, these publications publish creative writing and essays by the diverse student body across the University of Nairobi. Ngugi wa Thiong'o taught in the literature department at Nairobi University after graduating from Makerere and played a key role in expanding it. He encouraged his students to look for publishing opportunities outside of the university, such as writing for the famous Ugandan political journal Transition. He taught, mentored, and later became good friends with the young Henry Chakava, now Dr. Henry Chakava, who would later become the father of East African publishing, working first for Heinemann and then the East African Publishing House and later East African Educational Publishers. In 1968, and forgive me, this touches on what Dr. Wanjala said earlier, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, along with Okot Bitek and Taban Loliong, as well as Henry Owo Onyumba, who were all teaching at the University of Nairobi at the time, they launched a revolution at the university and demanded the abolition of the English department in the spirit of decolonization that was sweeping across the African continent. This revolution, if you will, was successful, and in March 1969, a new syllabus was introduced, placing Afrophone literatures at the forefront. The Department of English Studies became the Department of Literature, and a new Department of African Literatures and Languages was also established. It is also important to be aware of the fact that from the late 1960s and early 1970s onwards, the University of Nairobi became a refuge for many Ugandan academics fleeing the oppressive regimes of Milton Obote and Idi Amin. And it's therefore no coincidence that at around this time, the University of Nairobi's English department began to thrive. Okot Bitek, Taban Loliong, and Austin Bukenya are some of the names of academics and writers who chose to make a home for themselves in Kenya during the years of dictatorship in Uganda. They contributed to a vibrant literary scene in Nairobi throughout the 70s, which unfortunately came to a gradual halt with the election of Daniel Arap Moi in 1978. But this is something I'll talk about later in greater detail. So this was a brief overview of the history of the University of Nairobi in the 60s and 70s, and to see how it's interlinked with how interlinked it was with Makerere. And I shall now move on to discuss the publications by the Literature Department, Nexus and Busara. The publication Nexus was created in 1967, so a few years after Penpoint of Makerere University was created. One of the editors was Leonard Kibera, now a novelist and short story writer. Contributors were mostly students, however, a number of lecturers from across the University of Nairobi also submitted pieces. Nexus was short-lived, however, and later re-established as Busara in 1968. Grace Ogot, who is, as we all know, one of East Africa's championing literary figures, she was on the editorial board. And already here we can see the names of Ugandan writers and academics who at this point had left Uganda. So also on the editorial board were Taban Loliong and Henry Chimbugwe, better known under his pen name Enrico Seruma. There are two things that I would like to discuss that I found interesting from two issues of Nexus and Busara. So I'm sorry, I would normally share my screen because I'd want to show you screenshots of this that I found in the archives, but it's not possible now, so you have to contend with my quoting. The first is not an actual piece, but an advert for the play Rhythm of Violence by the South African playwright Lewis Nkosi in the pages of volume 1 of Nexus, published in 1967. Lewis Nkosi was a South African writer who criticized the apartheid regime in his fictional and non-fictional writing and was forced to spend 30 years in exile. Incidentally, he was also an attendee of the 1962 African Writers' Conference at Makerere University. The fact that his play was to be performed by the University of Nairobi's Dramatic Society demonstrates an independent Kenya's support for Nkosi, or at least the support of a small section of an educated elite of an independent Kenya, and their commitment to apartheid, anti-apartheid, and anti-colonialism. And I feel it speaks legions of Pan-African solidarity with Africans all over the continent. Another item I found interesting was a book review by what I presume to be a student, Nira Kent, of Grace Ogot's collection of short stories, Land Without Thunder, in volume 1, issue 2 of Busara, published in 1969. As a bit of background, Land Without Thunder was published in 1968 and contains short stories largely set in rural areas of Western Kenya. and it largely deals with themes surrounding the rural and the traditional, often in contrast with the urban and the modern, especially in light of Kenyan independence and decolonization. There are two sentences that particularly stood out in this book review to me. One is, quote, "It is a pity that rural people are so slow to assimilate to changing conditions around them," unquote. And the other is, quote, "People will get rid of their fears and superstitious beliefs in future when they are given opportunities to educate themselves," unquote. So like I said earlier, I'm not sure who the author is. I can only assume that they were a student at the University of Nairobi at the time of publication. But what I find particularly notable is the almost derogatory tone that they take in discussion of rural life in Kenya or East Africa. And I feel like a very patronizing class discrimination is evident, which was largely a result of the colonial imposition of Western capitalism in East Africa. And I find that this is a rather reflective of the other side of attitudes around independence. On the one hand, there was the urge to decolonize and return to one's roots, as it were, which is very Ngugi-esque. But on the other hand, with limitations to upward social mobility more or less removed, or rather race in theory was no longer a limiting factor in upward social mobility, there was what was also very prevalent was the urge towards modernization and urbanization, which largely went hand in hand with westernization. So it would also be interesting to think about, while many across East Africa united with the urge to decolonize, how many readers across the region would have agreed with this author's sentiments, and which also in a way reflected a form of East African unity. But this was a brief spotlight on Nexus and Busara in the 1960s, and I shall now move on to discuss these publications in the 1970s. I'm afraid I don't have as much to say as I have previously on publications in the 1970s.
Sorry, Anna, you have 6 minutes, and I will be strict a bit.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. I can finish in 6 minutes.
Thanks.
I'm afraid for this section, I don't have as much to say, simply because my research focuses more on the 60s. And when I was doing archival research, because of time restrictions, I didn't really look as much for sources from the 1970s. So I can only draw on my own conclusions from the material that I've been able to study. So as I discussed earlier, from the late 60s onwards, but especially from 1971, when Idi Amin Dada came to power in Uganda, the big names that could previously be seen populating the pages of Penpoint or Dhana gradually began to appear in the pages of Nexus and Busara at the University of Nairobi. So names such as Bahadur Tejani, Tabalno Leong, or Kotbitek. It is also interesting to observe that around the same time, we're looking at the list of contributors in the pages of Dhana. It largely consisted of students, and there were few academic contributors or professional writers, which is indicative of the gradual academic exodus from Makerere to the University of Nairobi. And to place these occurrences within historical context, when Idi Amin came to power in 1971, in that same year, the Ugandan government also made the decision to expel a large population of non-skilled or semi-skilled Kenyans working in the country, many of whom had been living in Uganda for years by this point. At the same time, Ugandan relations with Tanzania were breaking down, partly due to the fact that Tanzania granted refuge to Milton Obote, who fled Uganda when Amin came to power. So it's very interesting to observe this two-way dynamic. On the one hand, political and diplomatic relations between the East African countries were breaking down quite swiftly. But on the other hand, at an academic level, some would say at an elite level, relations were still very much alive and actively sustained through the University of Nairobi, acting as an asylum, if you will, or rather a haven to academics coming from Uganda. And in this way, intellectual networks within East Africa continued to be preserved and academic exchange more or less continued, even though political relations had collapsed. So in conclusion, just to wrap up and to connect the points that I've made into one coherent thread, I talked to you today about student publications by the different colleges of the University of East Africa, and how they promoted regional identifications and a sense of pan-East Africanism, if you will, with a particular focus on the University of Nairobi. I then looked at individual publications of Nexus and Busara and examined aspects of their content and how these demonstrated East African or African regional networks. I finally discussed the university publications in the 1970s, placing them within a context of a breakdown of East African relations. And I showed how nevertheless academic networks and exchange continue to be sustained. So I hope I've been able to convey the hope of the 1960s, the decade of independence, and how there were very vibrant regional networks within East Africa that were actively maintained at the main universities and which one could see in the student publications. So great were these academic networks that even when political relations worsened, intellectual networks continued to be preserved, so that when the East African community began to be re-established in the 1990s, this was brought about by a generation who were very aware of its potential from their memories of their student days in the 1960s. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna, for keeping time. You've given us 2 more minutes for the discussant. So Dr. Jennifer Mushiri, kindly give your comments to these 2 presentations. You have 7 minutes because Anna gave you 2 minutes more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gona. Good afternoon, everybody. It's been a pleasure listening to the 2 papers, which are very much related and about a subject that's very close to my heart. Thank you very much. I hope I'll be able to use the 7 minutes, 5 minutes very effectively. Now, we were listening to Dr. Wanjala, Alex, who's my colleague, and I'm glad he talked about this at a time when we are celebrating, 50 years, and therefore 50 years also of our Department of Literature. And what he has done is that, and he started by reminding us about the memo, the 1968 memo on the abolition of the English department, which actually is really the heart of the department as we know it today. He's gone back to recall the history of the current Department of Literature as we know it today. And I think, and this is something that Anna has also done, considering that this webinar is hosted by the Department of History, we are talking about something that's very important, that is the importance of remembering. As we look at 50 years back, what are we remembering and what do we take as we go forward? What do we take as we look to the future? He's also looked at the impact of the curriculum, and this is not just for literature, but in any department, because departments and curricula are both the products and producers of existing circumstances. That's what we are seeing from Alex's paper. He takes a historical look at scholarship, and he's very keen, again, something Anna has also done, very keen, again, as important in this webinar today, very keen on events, very keen on publications, very keen on the personalities behind these events, and therefore also the dates, which our friends in history are very concerned about. Mwalimu Mbongi is always talking about the importance of dates. And I noticed that both Anna and Alex have been very keen with dates. If you notice, every sentence began with in 1968, in 1967, in 1971. And this becomes very, very important as we do this thing of remembering. And we are talking about remembering in 2 ways. Remembering without the hyphen or brackets, and remembering, putting back together, And this is also important because we are asking ourselves from both papers, where is the archive? Where is the archive? And both papers are pointed us towards the importance also of keeping an archive. So that is also something that the papers have raised. Alex also talked about the growth of literary criticism and creative production over the years. Anna also brought in, Alex was talking about the people in the department from the 60s and the 70s, and Anna, the members of staff, and Anna brought in the students' publications. Again, a very nice and very good convergence of the 2. He reminded us about the need to preserve literary traditions, and he told us about the place of, forgive me if I keep talking about the Department of Literature, well, that's my home, but its influence on the other departments of literature in the country, because it is, like he said, it is the mother of most of the departments of literature in the country, both directly and indirectly, because it has contributed in training of personnel, influences on the curriculum, traditions even on postgraduate training, production of creative writers and other artistic producers. It is therefore a very rich part of a rich tradition in the production of knowledge, which is what today's papers are talking about. We're also talking about the convergence of intelligence and sensibility, whether it's from the writers or from the teachers, again, which we have seen in both papers. I'm trying to see if I can bring in both papers at the same time. Because if you're thinking about literature from both papers, we are saying it's about that which makes us human. How human have we been from the productions of the 60s, 70s, and today, and how human will we be in the next 50 years and beyond? So putting those together. And one of the questions that probably Alex's paper is addressing is the issue of the great tradition. Question is, are we still beholden to the great tradition? Alex, who belongs to that great tradition today, now that we are the Department of Literature? Who belongs to that literary canon? Number two, who decides who belongs to that literary canon? And three, probably on that, is how then do we demystify this canon and therefore demystify the great tradition? I think these are issues that the papers are making us think about. We're talking also about the place of literature in the decolonization process. And for both papers, the influences of the University of East Africa, whether it's the Makerere, Dar, or Nairobi, how have they influenced the production of literature, right from students' journals, and other productions, and also the teaching in the curriculum? How has it influenced? Alex also mentioned about the Ngugi's transformation over the years. And the fact that a lot of times we do not talk about the Department of Literature. We keep forgetting about the others, but we do not talk about the Department of Literature at the University of Nairobi without talking about Ngugi. We sometimes forget the others and their influences, but we do not forget Ngugi. But what has this transformation done for the scholarship, scholarship in literature in the larger East Africa, not just in the University of Nairobi? And he's also concerned about Ngugi's leftist influences. And do we still find the leftist influences in the curriculum today in the Department of Literature at the University of Nairobi? Or have we fully managed? One of the issues that the paper seems to be asking is, have we fully managed to embrace the spirit of the 1968 memo? So some of the things that Alex's paper and partly Adima's paper is raising. And when you go back to Adima's paper, apart from the things that I've said, to which they seemed to converge with Alex's paper, again, takes us back to history, the importance of history. The history of students writing in the 60s and 70s, whether we are talking about Pen Point or Nexus, Busara, Dana, and so on. What has been the impact of these publications on the idea of regional identity? Again, are we able to identify ourselves properly as East Africans right from the productions of these students? That's what one of the questions that Adima's paper seems to be asking. What has been the impact of these publications in the 60s, 70s, and probably later, even if Adima's paper is not talking about the 80s and the 90s and today? What has been the impact of those publications on the idea of identity, regional identity, yes, but also just identity as we know it in general? She also
Mushibi, 1 minute.
Okay, fine. So I think what we are saying here is the idea of remembering for both papers without having to repeat, the idea of remembering and remembering persons, voices, productions. What has it been? And the question that I'll still pose to the members today, the participants today, is where is the archive? Alex and Nadima have pointed us towards that direction, but where is the archive on the history of scholarship, be it in Nairobi or elsewhere? What are these places, that we can point to as we do this? And lastly, probably for the benefit of Adima, because I know you are studying about students' publications, there is a PhD that was done in our department, the Department of Literature, about students' journals, literary journals, by Macharia Mwangi. But we can talk about it after. You can ask me about it after this. But he has a thesis on that, and I'm sure it can help you. So, which way forward with the study of scholarship, with the scholarship of literature, going forward? Thank you, Mwalimu George.
Thanks for that. What Jennifer has done is to summarize the two papers, and basically she's given us kind of historiographical summation of the developments in both the papers that Adima and Dr. Wanjala has. There are two questions that I've raised, but before I raise those questions, I'll say that each of you will have 2 minutes. Dr. Wanjala and Adima, you'll have 2 minutes to address the questions that I'll raise. I think Dr. Mushiri has raised pertinent questions that she was saying you were trying to address, but maybe you could still speak to them briefly. She talks about who belongs to this great tradition, who decides who belongs to that tradition, and perhaps very provocative is to what extent does the department or the works that are actually emanating for the department currently epitomize the leftist ideas that Ngugi brought forth when they had that so-called revolution, and to what extent has the department really continued the tradition or embraced this radical leftist literary tradition that Ngugi brought into the fore? On the chart, there are two questions that Kefa and I'll pick those only two from the chart. Kefa Demba asks the question, this is to Dr. Wanjala, what is the nexus between Dr. Wanjala's and Ngugi's leftist inclination and the trajectory of literary metamorphosis at the University of Nairobi, right? Maybe that should be enough. The rest is an explanation. And then Mukaya is asking, from the introduction of your presentation, Dr. Wanjala, you kept on referring to the department where you work as English department. Dr. Wanjala works at the Department of Literature, not English department. That's a correction. But I think he's trying to ask, what's the distinction between English department and the Department of English? Maybe you could speak to that. Let's begin with Dr. Wanjala and then Ms. Adima. 2 minutes each, and then we'll move to the next presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your apt interpretation of our papers. Very quickly, English department, that's the name of the department. Remember, we teach English, so we can't be wrong. It's a mouthful to say English literature and languages, so it's just English department. About the great tradition. Again, the great tradition, just as I said in a few words, I try to demonstrate that during the colonial period, English was a discipline that trained people to become sort of elitist. They were being trained as emergent elites, and they had to think like the elites in England, which is a class-based society. So we're just training people in black skin to have white masks, as Fanon would say. And that is a great tradition. But with the radicalization of Ngugi and the beginning of Marxist thought and his becoming a socialist in his writing and training, he then decided to decolonize the curriculum in order to be in touch with the masses in Kenya, and so that the literature that we study would be pertinent to the general population of the country, rather than just being a part of a chosen cadre of Africans. And that is how they came out with this decolonized curriculum, which has been in place from 1970 to date. The focus in the curriculum was on Africa rather than England. And however, having said so, it does not mean that, you know, the previous training in being part of the elite was abandoned. No, it continued to exist. People are still trained in the great tradition. And that training, you know, once Ngugi was detained and people like Michere Mugo left the country, and there was political oppression during the 80s, as we've discussed by other presenters, it was more comfortable for people to avoid the critical ideology of Marxism and so on and so forth by falling back to the great tradition. And therefore, to date, there are two schools of literature: the nationalist school and the school of the Africanists. The Africanists are those who belong to the great tradition. However, our generation that came, you know, to the university, say in the 90s, late 80s, 2000s, are not aware of this. We've been trained in both traditions, so we take it for granted that we can operate here and there. So you will find in the Department of Literature the existence of all these people. And that is not a curse, it is more of a blessing. And as I said, Chris Wanjala has now formulated an ideology which we should think more deeply about, which marries the African tradition rather than going back into the English tradition of the 17th, 18th century. He goes back to the African culture and tradition and says that that is what should be married with the current, you know, the formalism that was favored by the people in the great tradition, so that we come up with what is known as the literary tradition of East Africa and examine literary texts produced from the region using that critical background. And these texts are there in existence. It's just that we haven't named all these approaches, which is what my paper is trying to do. We are trying to reflect on what we do at the Department of Literature, University of Nairobi, and other literature departments in Kenya in general. I hope
Thank you. Yes. All right. Adima, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Jennifer, for those excellent comments. To briefly answer some of the questions that were asked, who belongs to this great tradition, who decides? I think it's very interesting because in the 1960s, you could very much see that the production of literature was dedicated by university elites. Tabanlo Lyong, I think in the late 50s, early 60s, made a statement that East Africa was a literary desert, which many scholars over the decades have disagreed with, simply because East Africa has been producing some kinds of literature since the 1500s, just not necessarily in a textual form. A lot of it might have been oral literature, and much of it was not in English. So a lot was produced in native languages from around East Africa. So I think that that when the Department of English, especially at Makerere, was established first, and then at Nairobi, the professors there very much focused on the production of literature within those departments. And then the students that graduated from those universities, they later became publishers and writers and big contributors to the East African literary scene. So you can see that the direction of that literature in English, especially, was taking in the 1960s and maybe the early 1970s to an extent, was decided by a very small elite. A very small elite that was university educated and also produced in English. And I think it's very interesting if we think back to the 1962 African Writers Conference at Makerere University. It was the actual title of the conference was for African Writers of English Expression. So that automatically didn't include writers who are writing in, for instance, in Kiswahili or other African languages. And I feel that is very reflective, of it's very classist in a way, because being able to speak English certainly at the time was an indication of class, and you know, able to access educational institutions that would teach in English. And also, yeah, it was very elitist in a way. So that also reflects who decided the direction that literature was to take in the 60s and 70s. And to what extent does the department epitomize leftist ideas of Ngugi? Yeah, I think this is just repeating what Dr. Wanjala said earlier, the very fact that, you know, from the 70s onwards, not only Ngugi, but other writers were arrested and detained. It reflects that these leftist ideas continue to be espoused, even though regimes weren't happy with that. And the same could be, a similar case could be made for Uganda from 1970 onwards, when cultural production very much came to a halt after Idi Amin came to power. And those leftist anti-establishment ideas, they were certainly in a Ugandan context, were maybe produced abroad or not at all, just because many writers were punished very severely, if not killed, in Uganda, if they dared to criticize the regime. And I think I am out of time, so I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adima, for that brief comment. We'll move forward to have our next set of presenters. Professor Musambai Katumanga and Dr. Kathleen Anangwe. Professor Katumanga was struggling to join us because of the confusion we had earlier. Kindly, let's see if is Professor Katumanga with us. Could you kindly move and present to the participants? There you are. All right, Prof, welcome. Sorry for the trouble, but it's a pleasure to have you in this webinar. Go ahead. You have 15 minutes, but I'll give you, because you're honoring us. We'll give you slightly more. Dr. Anjala actually took more, and so go ahead. We'll see how it goes. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, my brother and friend, George Gona. My special appreciations and thanks to the organizers of this session in broad terms. But more specifically, I would want to acknowledge, of course, the DVC, Professor Ogengo, and of course, our Dean. I'm also taking this opportunity to salute all colleagues herein assembled for this discussion. The predicate of the predicate these historians have given us stems from an assumption that Marx may have Marx lived in the department, but he no longer does live in our department as it is. But in essence, what I understand them to be trying to challenge us is to prove that we're still relevant to the society, and the basic assumption that at one particular time, we probably were more vibrant and probably engaged in so much process of trying to engender certain kind of change within our society. I want to make some few observations over here that are not necessarily built through a long durée appreciations of all these dynamics, but in appreciating essentially the fact that to discuss or to try and put into context what Marx's influence may have been in the department, and perhaps in essence, the role of the department in the society, is essentially what I am being asked to try and look at over time in space. In addition to that, then it behoves upon me to then try as much as possible to do three things. One, to bring into context that that engagement or that convergence of perspectives that then lead to conclusions or assumptions that in fact that was the case and the situation with respect to the department itself. But secondly, how that is then undertaken to try and perhaps put into context what political scientists see themselves and what is expected of them, and in reference to what society is conceived by political scientists, and perhaps expectations by political elite in the society with respect to what they expect academics to do, which then leads sometimes or essentially to these frictions that would generate, essentially manifest themselves across a wide range of the history of what forms the Kenyan state today. And of course, the third aspect will be more methodological in terms of then anchoring these convergences, these engagements and of cooperations and exits among, rather between political scientists and the society, or rather the state in general. And then of course, if time does allow, try as much as possible and then tell us where essentially the department and political scientists as a whole are. I'll also try as much as possible to engage you or to bring you to the appreciation essentially of the extent of this predicate in terms of where Marx essentially is. So one would make an argument right from the onset that indeed Marx did exist and he still does exist in the department, but it's more a question of the perspectives that were dominant in that particular time as a point of reference. And the flip side of it in terms of the fact that indeed, after the department played its role, you see Marx and you see the whole essence of his statement, which I paraphrase here. Philosophers have only interpreted the world, right, in various ways. But what remains is fundamentally the necessity to change it. So to the extent to which they did indeed try to bring about changes, they eventually generated or brought us to conditions or situations within which protest is in essence what has built and what continues to shape the Kenyan society today, and in fact, the entire Eastern African region, or Africa in particular, in general. So that appreciation brings us to our trying to then understand what it is that was happening to the point at which not only did the university itself, led by political scientists, become a foci of these struggles, whether it's in class, where Marx then would have been made to manifest himself, or in fact in the libraries, where the memory of Marx does live, and more specifically, how then they try to engage then groups in the society, very few in nature. If you recall the group in parliament then that used to be referred to as the Five Sisters, and the nexus between them and their colleagues within the university, and more specifically, the other foci which lined itself, or rather existed in the senior common room, where all these different departments once in a while would have groups of people who would then interact and meet and plot out ways and manners and forms within which they saw the state itself to be set out to evolve, and by inference then the contentions that existed between them and the society. So in effect, one would want to basically look at the relationship between the department and the government more specifically, in terms of what you may call contending perspectives over what society was supposed to be and is going to have to be, which then takes us back to the basics of what we then understand political science to be inclined towards. Sometimes it may be referred to as politology, and other times, in terms of its own evolution, there are those who thought the department should, in effect, if you were trying to look at the origins of the department itself, you'll be so surprised that in the period of the 60s, what you call political science and public administration today began essentially as what we call commerce and government. But it will take the period of 1971 that the department then emerges with its first chair, Professor John Okumu, to emerge as an entity by its own self. There are, of course, a lot of popular narratives that have tended to advance a notion that they were one way or another constricted or constrained by the governments of the day from adopting the name political science for themselves, that is not essentially the case. So as political scientists, we begin by appreciating the fact that the name political science, of course, becomes the order of reality around the period of 2001, 2002, when departments across all over East Africa responding to the whole notion of the necessity of merging or having or developing common norms and systems of education, or the East African Council, if you so wish, opted to have that. And so Makerere, Dar es Salaam, and Nairobi ended up adopting that common name of political science and public administration. But more fundamental is the basic appreciation then that as a department or as a field of study, political science will essentially be inclined towards maximizing on whatever knowledge that can be derived from history to basically try to investigate what the state has essentially been. At the second level, it will engage in all aspects of analytical studies, and essentially here in trying to then understand from empirical point of views and to review how this study, how this state then is in reality in terms of its institutions, in terms of its power relations within groups and societies, and actors within the society, in terms of modes and forms of mobilization, what you may want to then call political sociology, if you so wish. But in addition to that, the third variable, of course, that is very critical here is in terms of how then political scientists expect to play their roles in transforming their society or the state for that matter. And the issue here is, what is it that a state is supposed to be? So the moral question of what type of a state political scientists should have, should conceive or think of as a functional role becomes very critical in then sometimes defining the relationships they will always tend to have with political actors, so that at a given point or time, they will in one way or another, and they are expected not for all practical purposes to be conformist, but as a matter of fact, to keep questioning and interrogating whatever exists in the society and appreciating the basic fact that the decisions as to how man should govern himself, which is a fundamental role of a political scientist, and more specifically with respect to why societies emerge and how they should be governed relative to the whole fundamental question of power, then basically implies that at a given point in time, they will arrogate themselves with that notion of not just being a science, but going out of the way to, as much as possible, using method to validate that kind of position. And so in that kind of a sense, then you basically begin to appreciate why right from the onset, you will have frictions beginning as soon as possible with respect to the relations that will then emerge between political scientists when they existed, and of course, the political forces that what you call the dominant factions in the society then sought to evolve and to have with respect to what they thought was their vision in terms of how a state itself should evolve. And so the role of political theory here becomes fundamental right from the word go, right from the onset, how institutions should be evolved, how people should be led, what type of leadership was expected. But in all this, we have to appreciate right from the onset that you are talking about largely a period that was defined by a binary situation. In other words, you have a Cold War that was raging at that particular moment in time. And so for all practical purposes, there really wasn't a space, a leeway within which people would not align themselves with two camps that also did reflect the type of alliances, external forces in themselves sought in one way or another to back the then existing regime infrastructure that existed in the Republic of Kenya all the way through. So if we were to basically then try to periodize the Kenyan state, you are then talking about the period of from around from independence, including 1965 to 1971, when the department emerges. And at that particular period of time, you already begin to see tensions, more specifically in terms of the economic path taken by the state, the implications of the colonial structures that were inherently in place and their succession by a new political elite, especially when it came to questions of the agrarian questions within the society. And so groups like KPU, which sought in one way or another to articulate a different framework or a form of development, of course, began to increasingly find a lot of resonance among a large pool of intellectuals at that particular time. But it is the period, the second period from 1978, that will be very fundamental over here, that will then begin to coalesce these tensions in a very interesting kind of manner. But before we do that, one will have to basically try to understand the dominant framework that is existing at this particular time. And here, to appreciate that, one will have to go back to look at some of the core writings that emerged. And one of them, of course, is the publication of Colin Leys with respect to what he referred to as under development in Kenya, the political economy of neo-colonialism, right, from the period of 1969 to 71. This comes about in the period of 1975. And so if you look at the thrust of, or rather the thesis of Colin Leys, it's the reminder of the limits of what you call options of development that is available to Kenya, given the existing structures of dependency that make it impossible for the political elite to break out. But this is despite the arguments that the political elites are trying to sell to the public that in fact they have evolved or they're evolving a developmental state. What is of course of interest is the basic fact that they have developed mechanisms through Ndego Commission and others within which predatory activities are beginning to take root within the society itself with far-reaching consequences. Of course, this Colin Leys thesis puts into operation what will then later on be known as the Kenya debate. And of course, you'll be joined by the likes of Steve Langdon and the rest of, and of course, Brett. The shift of that perspective with the thesis that will be produced by Nicola Swenson, which will lead to another counter-shifting position by Colin Leys, notwithstanding, will try to bring this new argument about what they see as the development of corporatist or cooperative or corporate capitalism within Kenya. And so the imagination over here is in fact that there is a certain kind of alternative development that is emerging, within which, of course, the state is playing a very fundamental role in anchoring and supporting this indigenous capitalism that is emerging. This, of course, will be debunked later on by Kaplinski and others. So from this particular context, and of course, the political violence that the state will begin committing on its own, rather the elites holding power will begin committing on their populations, as was, of course, manifest by the assassination of J.M. Kariuki in 1975, will then lead to almost what you're beginning to see as a break between a large number of intellectuals who are then beginning to evolve and emerge within the Kenyan society, especially the university, a rupture that, of course, is complete by the time Moi takes over power in the period of 1978. So what you begin to see is that by 1982, two factions have essentially emerged. Moi as the then incumbent who is holding power is maximizing on the external support he's getting. But on the other hand, you then have a large pool of intellectuals within the department that have emerged. So you can talk about almost two groups. The first, of course, will be those who adhere essentially to this Marxist perspective, from dependency theories to all the way to what you call the world systems theories. And secondly, of course, you will have other political scientists in the department who do not necessarily take that perspective, but they are as equally as important as and concerned about the developments within the society, but their mode of engagement is different. So if what you're calling those adhering to a leftist orientation, you will have groups of people like Professor Nick Onjoy, and of course the Trotskyite then at that particular time, Professor Apollo Njonjo. But we got to also appreciate the fact that their engagements are not confined to the Department of Political Science alone. So you also begin to see them spreading out and having allies all the way through the Department of Law, of course, in the Department of History. I need to mention another variable which is very critical here, that in the evolution of the department, and rather the university at that particular time with respect to social sciences, what you see consistently is an aspect of interdepartmental engagements and cross-pollination that is taking place. And so there's an increased emphasis of students cutting across to edit courses across departments. And that's how you begin to see some of these perspectives also spreading out through students and their expectations in terms of what is expected of them with respect to their roles within the society. So the Kenya debate, of course, will be anchored eventually within the department with the review of African political economy that will be published in 1981 by Professor Nyong'o. And among, of course, main actors and the key issues over here, number one, are in terms of trying to debunk the actual reality or the so-called notion of development within the society. And more specifically, the populist assumptions about which regions were actually benefiting from the regime itself. So what you begin to see is attempts by the likes of historian Mukaru Nganga to try and explain to us what is happening to peasants, especially in Moranga and all these other places, and especially when peasants lose their small pieces of land, what then happens? You also have Professor Nyong'o coming out very strong, more specifically in trying to, from a methodological point of view, helping us to try and understand who actually a peasant, who the friends of the peasantry are, and what is essentially happening to the peasants in rural Nyanza for that particular, to that particular extent. Of interest, perhaps as a passing reference, is to understand sometimes the meanings of names and the characters of individuals essentially involved. So in trying to understand this and in having basically tried to interact with the likes of Professor Nyong'o, the first appreciation is, of course, his name, Anyang. Anyang is basically a reference to a crocodile. And a larger part of the time when you sit next to Professor Nyong'o, every time he'll give you that kind of an impression he's asleep, just like a crocodile. It has these tendencies of giving you an impression. It is not necessarily seeing you, it is completely disinterested, but that is the moment when it's playing the patience game, and that is when it's really going to strike. So what is this analogy altogether about? You basically try to understand his name as Peter, this rock, and his character as a crocodile, and his patience that goes about. This will be the symptomatic appreciation of a large number of these political scientists within the department, and the consequences they will have to pay by trying as much as possible to take on the system against or rather its violence notwithstanding. So you begin to notice, among other things, that most of them will find themselves in exile, and they will pay their personal prices, losing family members, and of course, others, not just the professors alone, but rather within the student communities, you begin to see a very high level of violence that will result to some being jailed, others dying like at Tungosi and what have you, and others, of course, migrating into exile. Others, of course, will reemerge in the 80s, rather in the 90s, Wafule Bupes and others of these fall in this particular category. So besides of course, Nyong'o and the whole question of what the finance capital will have, you'll also have other scholars within the department, again, falling within that category of the left-wing aspect of or component of the department. And here you'll have others who will then not necessarily be directly vocal to engage the government, but they will take a much more radical position, but with a different form of engagement. And I guess this will be more a function of the fact that at a certain point of time, especially in the period of 1989, you will see the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War comes to an end. And with it, a new dynamic in terms of perspectives. And what will begin to happen over here is the basic fact that there is a shift in terms of the understanding of not just the nature of the state itself, but the power relations within it. And more specifically, disappointments that will begin emerging with respect to what was expected to be change that was coming and the reality of that specific change itself. But before we do that, we need to go a little bit back behind to where we've just where we've passed by trying to understand a very interesting phenomena when we then compare the dominant actor that particular time, Daniel Arap Moi, the then president, in the period of the 80s when he takes power, to 1991 when he decides all of a sudden that now it is important to introduce political pluralism. And that will essentially define right from the onset his engagement with these political scientists and the relationships that they will both essentially have. So what you begin to notice is that Moi's ways of fighting these actors is actually a manner of borrowing from Marx himself. So if you take, for instance, his ideological, pardon? Hello.
Hello, 2 minutes for you to finish. Right.
Okay. So in the case of Moi, you see his ability to construct ideology in polemical terms, similar to what Marx had essentially done, and his attempts to construct ideology in forms of what you call latent forms, again, in a way, both latent and epiphenomenal conceptions are all borrowed up from Marxian ways of in one way or another, expurgating and lampooning enemies. So in this case, what you begin to see is that Moi begins to accuse these intellectuals of being far removed in a polemical sense from the reality, and him being more authentic in terms of development of the society itself, much more than they are able to do. But by the time he accepts that necessity, most of these political scientists have appreciated then the role of not just the impact of the base or the substructure in forming the nature of a society itself, but more specifically the shift towards the superstructure and how consent is eventually manufactured in the society to allow what you call consensus, to allow what you call consent. So borrowing very extensively from Gramsci, you begin to see this shift resulting into a number of these political scientists beginning to increasingly get concerned about other aspects within the society itself, from institutions, and this is what will happen with Njuguna Ngere and others who will shift to form what you call Institute of Policy Analysis and Research. And there you will see the whole question of the 60s of sessional paper number 10 being revised, being interrogated relative to other policy positions from health, agriculture, and the rest. But in addition to that, you'd see that in the period of the 90s, apart from just the frictions that you will have with these political scientists and the state, you'll also begin to see hopes and forms of engagement that result more specifically in very an unusual institution of the government's engaging political scientists. You'll have the military, you'll have intelligence, you will have including, of course, the government itself. So by the time you're talking about political science in the period of 2020, you're beginning to see a department that has expanded, a department that has also engaged society, not just in terms of its publications with regard to the basic questions of institutions and electoral processes, but the challenges, including modes and forms of violence within the society itself, that are shifting these dynamics of state-society relations. And so you'll see other political scientists that begin to grapple with the fundamental aspects of civil society organizations. Of course, my younger colleagues, Woche and Jonyo. You'll also see positions that are expanding what was then essentially international relations into more emphasis and appreciations of the state's role in terms of the pursuits of its foreign policy and interests, where you'll have other scholars like Nying'oro in foreign policy. So in effect, what you're seeing is that the political scientists will continue to pay the price, including engagements with respect to constitution making, where you've seen the likes of Odhiambo Mbai and the likes of Adam Soloy in what you're calling the BBR. But you will continue to see tensions that will keep on emerging as a result of the fact that the whole aspect of transformation in the society and the whole necessity for protests and how that protest should take place is essentially a function that we see this process of engagements in scholarship and method of bringing about transformation in the society being mobilized by political scientists in different forms of others, to the extent to the 80s, where we also had processes of not just exchanges in terms of the pen itself, but a situation where the options of armed struggles have been, and in effect, were operationalized by a few of those political scientists in the name of what used to be referred to as Mwakenya, what used to be referred to as Pambana. All these options converge in terms of different forms of mobilizing, organizing society to respond to given challenges. So in effect,
thank you very much. Sorry for the, you got more time because I got disconnected. So you have taken more than what I expected, but thank you very much, Prof, for those important that important input in this webinar. We'll go straight to hear Dr. Kathleen Anangwe. We'll give Kathleen 15, 17 minutes, so that then after that, Dr. Solomon Woche will give a response to these two papers. Continue, bringing in your questions, write them at the bottom. I lost quite a bit of the chat, so I hope we can actually revise that and have the questions on the chat so that we can ask Dr. Anangwe and Professor Katumanga. Welcome, Dr. Anangwe.
Thank you, George. I am glad to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation to the Department of History and Archaeology to inviting me to participate in this timely webinar. I thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on a topic that you gave me that is still having me scratch my head a little bit, because there is a lot I can say and 15 minutes doesn't do justice to it. I start off by saying that all protocol observe. I see this idea that was given to me about basically but basically breathe in a little bit of the historical trends, because just like our counterparts in political science and in history, we do use history. We use history to sort of situate our thoughts across the basic trajectories of social development and social evolution. And then I will try to infuse the names. You'll hear me sometimes name drop. I'm going to try and infuse the names of the various scholars who are in the Department of Sociology, some of them who are still there, some who have left, who actually managed to circumvent various political and historical scenarios, but at the same time who are able to sometimes shape new trajectories or build up new ideas based on the old ones, and sometimes going off in a totally different direction. At the outset, I need to say that sociologists are an interesting breed of individuals. We don't necessarily go into rabble rouse like our friends across the corridor. I shall not mention their name, they know themselves, and Katumanga alluded to that. We sometimes have been accused of being armchair because of the way in which we approach issues.
Kathleen, speak to your microphone closer.
Am I seeming to fade away?
Yes.
All right. So I will just say that we tend to sometimes be accused of being armchair simply because of the way we are measured, and basically tend to want to drive agendas from a very well thought out and practical perspective, of course, with an intended end in mind. So we don't just do things for the sake of them, but we look to see that the end that we want, the calculated end, is actually achieved. So I start off by saying that sociology is the queen of the sciences, and we still hold that very dear title based on the founding fathers, whom we share with the other social sciences. So I ask the question: is the crowd still cheering? And then I will draw out what sociological studies may have been going on and the debates surrounding those studies. The beginning of the department, or the origins, start out at about 1968, 69. From then on, we have now become the largest department in the Faculty of Arts, give or take. And we tend to attract students who want to understand the way in which societies, processes, systems, and structures interface. And having said that, that is not in itself an end, but rather students are able to see that that is the beginning. So our faculty jumps in at that point to help students see, or to enable students see, or to facilitate students to see the way in which macrostructures and mesostructures and microstructures all interface. Now, doing all that theoretically is easy. But then when you come to looking at our own context, and context is everything to sociologists, you find an African context that is not so well laid out as any other would be. We have more peaks than lulls every other time that we look up or we look down. So I am going to be looking at the 70s, the turbulent 70s, perhaps the even more turbulent 80s, and still piggyback on the structural adjustment programs and the politics of the day that have led us to the 90s and the much calmer new millennium, but with new trajectories of thought emerging. So in this department of sociology, we are always in step with the current political and historical trends, because, like I said, the context is everything. We're using our sociological imagination. We're using the perspectives that are emerging. And so you look at a department that has grown from a lot of theory in the 70s to now a more vibrant and robust reality that is more of the applied sociology. And so in the units that we tend to offer in the department, you will see that at the end of every unit, even when the theory is the driver, we tend to see, okay, so how does this relate to what is going on in society today? And we inspire, the faculty will inspire students to think in terms of emerging trends and creating new trajectories going forward. So we have a vibrant faculty to that extent. Now, the concerns of sociology historically have been steeped in a dynamic social fabric. And that dynamic social fabric is aware of all other currents that are flowing in society, the dialectics that are going on, the voices that speak and those that do not speak. And perhaps that is why I will stress a little bit more when I'm talking about the cheering crowd. And And the most vibrant debates in the department right across from the 70s to date have been carried or are carried on the shoulders of social development. And there we find intersections with the IDS department, again, history and political science and economics, so to speak. So what we see is a discussion around social change. When is it happening? Why is it happening? Where is it happening? And to whom is it happening? And that is when we bring in the so-called cheering crowd. The dialectics in the department itself have fed into local narratives. That means we have had faculty, some of whom are very visible on the forefront, and I'll talk about some of those, some of whom are driving agendas in terms of social change and the cheering crowd from the periphery, and others who are now infused into policy. That's the new trend we have. So at the beginning, where we have scholars who would have been more vocal, even on public platforms, you now find that the sociologists have reinvented themselves within the department, and they're seeking to enjoin policy and discuss policy related issues in terms of driving social change. So the question, we begin with questions in most of our sociological debates, and in this one of the cheering crowd, it is not very different. I then ask the question to start off the thinking. What constitutes a crowd? You know, when you talk about a crowd, what constitutes that crowd? Who are the players? What persons who are the actors? Is it men and women? Is it men and women of different strata in society, or are some strata more represented than others? We ask, what are the unifying factors? You know, what is the ethos driving the crowd? Remember, I have still not defined what the crowd is. Is the ethos found within history? Is the ethos found within politics? Is the ethos geographical? I also ask the question, can the crowd drive change? And that is where the Marxist narrative finds a locus. When you look at the crowd driving change, is the change meaningful? And so you'll find a lot of the sociological debate going on now around whether we can actually drive a revolution or not. Sociologists tend to say, okay, so where has a successful revolution occurred that did not need a crowd? So to that effect, we defer to the reality that, well, you need a crowd, but that crowd that causes the revolution, whether it's ideological or real in existence, creates another crowd. And so at the end, I'll be asking the new question that emerges from this one. Who is being cheered by that crowd? Who is the crowd cheering? Can we see what the crowd is cheering? Or is it an illusion that the crowd is harboring, and therefore that illusion disappears the moment the crowd disappears? We talk about crowds in sociology in the realm of collective behavior and social movements, and we say crowds are interesting to study because they dissipate. You would, coming after 1 hour or 2 hours of a crowd gathering, you might never know that the crowd was actually there. And then why are they cheering? Is there another way in which they can be heard or in which they can get their message across? So we start off, when you talk about the cheering crowd, by looking at the type of crowd. Is it a casual crowd? Is it just come together because of happenstance? Is it orgiastic? Is it driven by high emotion, and when the emotion dies, the crowd is no longer there and they lose focus? Or is it actually a mob and a riot? And so you tend to see sociology coming in to focus on crowds and crowd ideology and crowd philosophy, having borrowed from the Chicago School. Now, those sociologists who are studying the Chicago School, who comprise the Chicago School, would have been influencing highly our own sociologists in the 70s. So, they were basically together. So what they saw the crowd as coming off the Industrial Revolution is a group of people very much like the unionists trying to cause change now and saying that if this change does not happen now, then something will never happen, to that extent. But you see an evolving crowd, cheering crowd, of course, an evolving crowd to present days where the cheering crowd is even more of an enigma, because you can find very many factors within that same crowd. By factors, I mean very many interests represented in that same crowd. So I still steep my argument in the classics and say that the interest in crowds and the composition of crowds and the mobility of crowds is basically very classical in its approach. So what we see is a return to the interest in crowds, because what happens is as you come to the 80s, SAPs, and the 90s, where you have the change in constitution, repeal 2A, you find individual interests sometimes advancing ahead of a crowd. But now we see a return to the crowd in terms of numbers have meaning, and crowds asking themselves introspective questions. Why am I standing here and who am I cheering? What is in it for me as a crowd? And that's where you see the conglomeration around ethnicity, because if we are that crowd, perhaps we can get more mileage. But to link all those ideas and thoughts that I have laid out before you is to, I'm going to now try and pick out various trajectories that the luminaries in the department may have posited and then run off with or shared with us, and then we who are still in the department are having to sort of wiggle our way around and try to unpack and repack new systems of thought. So I go back and I think I try to pick on the more dynamic faculty that we've had who have been on the front stage. And in this realm, I think of firstly the late Katama Mkangi, who very interestingly was able to provide an anthropological lens. He was in the Department of Sociology, but an anthropologist. And he was saying, he was talking at a time when the narrative was to Africanize. And if you ever came across him, he radiated Africanness, whatever that would be. I could explain it a lot later, but in the interest of time, he was talking about the need for African actors, whether men or women. And at that time in the history of the department, there was this shift towards gender and the gender analysis and the gender conversations and the equality of the genders. And Mkangi was quick to say, these may be Western narratives. Think about them, reflect on them, make sure that in espousing them, you don't lose your spirit of Africanness. The African must remain in your sociology. And he did that very interestingly by beginning a debate, not so much about the cheering crowd, but by asking the cheering crowd, which would have been a lot of us women. He was asking us, look at some terminologies that you're already floating. When you talk about FGM, female genital mutilation, is it mutilation? Don't just take it on face value. Perhaps think about other terms that would apply to us. Perhaps female genital cutting. And we would look at him and say, but are you still behind it? And of course, the debate still continues therein. So he was basically saying that culture is a big part of our social structure. And even as a crowd, when you are talking about new narratives, new paradigms, do not lose your culture, because that culture holds you together. As a cheering crowd, you still have a culture. In that culture, you owe each other to be each other's, you owe each other a responsibility to consider each other going forward. And then I pick on Professor Bithi, our former Vice Chancellor, who perhaps is even more renowned as a rural sociologist. Now look at the dimensions there. We already begin going along our own disciplines. And what Professor Bithi was able to do in perhaps writing the most important book that sociologists use even to date about rural sociology was to provide in that book the idea that the peasantry and pastoralists are still on the margins. Now, how does that relate to the cheering crowd? He was talking about development occurring, because that's what we were chasing after in the late 70s, early 80s, development at all costs. And while we're doing that, crowd was part of the consideration. He was telling us, as you think about these crowds, in effect, pockets of people, think about their needs and their wants as you try to match them to their resources. And he was able to show in that book that pastoralists are still lagging behind. They are the crowd who are cheering, but they're still behind all of that narrative. So the question, what are they cheering? Why are they cheering? If you ask the pastoralists, they might look at you and say, actually, what was it again? And that is what Bithi was warning us against, because there's a downside to that. Bithi's trajectory of thought has been picked up very graciously by Professor Mutsoso, who still has a lot of work around pastoralists. And it would be interesting to hear him say that the tenets that Bithi provided in drawing attention to that category of people, is still out there. Nothing really may have changed. If it has changed, very little, and it ought to change faster, because if we talk about social development occurring for the whole of Kenya, it ought to be in tandem rather than in pockets, and therefore, because we know those pockets will cause a lot more social stratification. I then pick up, I leave Bithi's argument there, and I'll come back to it a little bit later, but I pick up, because I'm using the thread of social development, I pick up on the influence or the contribution of Professor Mburugu, who is still there, as a vibrant demographer. Now, Mburugu was doing something interesting, or in his demography does something interesting, because as he looks at the cheering crowd, Mburugu is asking, wait a minute, this crowd may be becoming bigger or greater than our resources.
Kathleen, I'll give 7 minutes.
Okay, demographers are still very hell-bent, basically, on the fact of matching individuals with resources. And that is really their job. So he was saying, can we begin to control these crowds? Of course, controlling a cheering crowd does not mean diffusing its ideas. It simply means, can we have a crowd matched to a reality? And the reality must be able to deliver. And I quickly go to Professor Mbula Bahemuka, who is a sociologist in her own right, who is a member of the department and interested in sociology of a major area is sociology of religion. With sociology of religion, again, the crowd becomes a centerpiece of that, because the beliefs and values that run inside the crowd are what we can harness in terms of developing as a society. And she asks various questions which are visible in her activities today as the chair of UNESCO UNITWIN, which is housed in the Department of Sociology. So that collaboration that Professor Mbula is professing in her sociology of religion in terms of a need for values and beliefs is what she passes on to the youth, basically telling them, if you're a cheering crowd, you must know what you're cheering for. And that really is her message. Now, in discussing all those sociologists, I have not ignored the social work department or the social work dimension, which is in our department as well. These social workers are an interesting dimension in that they focus on the cheering crowd, which is forgotten. And by forgotten, I use that word very loosely, forgotten meaning which is institutionalized. And social workers have got a place in sociology in terms of reminding us, basically, that it is our conscious responsibility to ensure that the people or the individuals or the population that has been set aside is reintegrated in society. And that is part of the spirit of the cheering crowd. And so I want to end on where I think the proponents of having me contribute in this to this session were thinking I would start. I'm ending with that. Professor Odegi, who was a member of our department until recently, wrote a book called The Rise of the Cheering Crowd. And this is where the discussion is centered, even though I presented it in a flipped sort of mode. But in his book, he was challenging the powers that be. In his book, he was saying, wait a minute, we have crowds here that are cheering, but nobody really is asking the question, what are they cheering for? And are they gaining at the end of cheering? So he's a luminary in the department that did not just start the debate, but he blew it out of the water. So while all the luminaries I've talked about were scholarly, presenting their work and packaging it, Odegi did the opposite and flipped it and said, here it is, here is my argument, and it's an argument that the political class need to respond to. Of course, that earned him a few months in one place where he was asked to repent of his sins, and whether he did that or not, is another debate for another day. So what we see there is Odegi basically saying that we have pockets of cheering crowds in our society who have been forgotten and who need to reflect on the cheering that is going on. That they should not be expected to continue cheering, but rather when they begin asking fundamental questions, which scholars are not providing, then we might see a different kind of, in other words, to place it a little bit more palatably, a different Kenya. If the cheering crowd continues without acknowledgement, then we might find ourselves in a very hard place, a rock and a hard place. And that may be where we are right now, that there is a cheering crowd, and sometimes the political class is afraid of, because they cannot estimate or predict what are they cheering for, where are they cheering, where is this cheering going on, can we still control the cheering crowd? So I end with the questions that I said I would ask. Basically, having given you a little overview about what the cheering crowd is doing, why it is still a question in sociology, and to, in a way, reflect on the fact, or impinge on the fact that this is basically so the question, is the crowd still cheering? I would say yes. Is it still cheering? But providing answers. Sociology, what sociology does, by not providing those hard-nosed answers, it opens up new ideas and new avenues of asking ourselves, what is the crowd going to do next? And it is our job and our great delight to try and predict what it will do next. So to that extent, I would say that the cheering crowd provides impetus to history, provides meaning to history, inspires politics, but most of all, it provides sociology with an explanation of a dynamic context that exists now and for the next 50 years, that is driven by thought from within the department, that is given direction by the new ideas of new thinkers standing on the shoulders of the luminaries in the Department of Sociology at the University of Nairobi over the last 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for your presentation. Dr. Owoche will give some response to Professor Katumanga and Dr. Nango's presentations, and then we'll follow that up with a couple of questions. And again, we'll give Kathleen and Professor Msambai 2 minutes each to offer some reaction to these questions and concerns. So over to you, Dr. Owoche.
Thank you so much, the moderator. And I have to say, I've learned a lot from the presentation by the two. I simply want to begin by pointing out that the two presenters have been able to give us the nexus or the link, the apparent linkage between the Department of Political Science and sociology. And I simply begin with an epigraph. If you remember the works of Aristotle, he argued that man is not only a social animal, but man is also a political animal. And when Professor Msambai and Kathleen were talking, I came to the realization that what was said by this great political theorist, Aristotle, have actually come to bear today. And it is on that platform that I argue that given the rich historical account by both our presenters, I've come to the deduction or the conclusion that history is indeed not an exercise in futility. And I simply want to thank the chairman of the Department of History, and of course, the university management and other administrators, including our dean, for making this nexus or the relationship between history, political science, and sociology to come to the fore. When they were presenting, of course, I've seen a lot of similarities in their presentation. One, they talk about the crowd. And I'm generally impressed with Kathleen's idea of the crowd. I've never seen the crowd as holding much. I always adhere to the thinking of Aristotle, Plato, and that great Italian philosopher called Norberto Bobbio. Norberto Bobbio simply argued that the crowd, and I quote him, is stupid. The crowd is so emotional. The crowd will never, and I repeat again, the crowd will never be an agent of social change. The crowd being emotional, the crowd being irrational, simply look for leadership elsewhere. And this was even said by what Professor Katumanga was talking about. According to Karl Marx, this change, this development of society cannot come or emanate or originate from the crowd. The crowd does not think. It's like a mob. So the argument is that anytime you're talking about social change, something that the professor did not talk so much about, it is inevitable. But this change must be violent. This change must be driven by radical ideas. These radical ideas must be class anchored. So it is all about class and class consciousness. And it is based on that while the professor argued that Karl Marx was basically trying to look at the linkage between theory and the empirical, there is something that we missed, particularly when we're talking about the department, particularly when we're talking about Kenya. What is this that we missed? This is all about economic determinism. This is all about economic change. It is all about economic theory. And the reason why political science, particularly the department, has not been able to play the role expected of it is simply because we lack class consciousness. And beyond that, we are always thinking about economics defined in terms of our pockets. So that even when we are talking, let me borrow what Kathleen said, we are talking economics, but this economic is driven by ethnicity. So that even before somebody talks, I'm sorry to use this example, I already know his position in terms of the change he will be referring to. Because, to quote our former vice president, your name already betrays you. And I think that is why we have not been able to be effective agents of social change or agents of social development. So Karl Marx's theory was based on the physical world. He was dismissive of anything that was metaphysical. Anything to do with religion, whatever Kathleen was talking about, was dismissed. But only dismissed to the extent that if religion cannot give us that change, because the mob, what he refers to as the crowd, is always engaged in escapism, then you dismiss religion altogether. So my argument is that, yes, society, sociology, political science is about the end. But what is this end? That is something that you people all of us must address. And to address it, we must be pragmatic. When you talk about Karl Marx, he tried to bring in science. He studied a specific society. And his argument was that, I am looking at England. What we are seeing in England, what I'm able to describe based on history, should be replicated elsewhere. Has it been replicated in Kenya? No. Why is it so? Simply because we do not have a rigid class system. I have heard my colleagues talk about Anyang' Nyong'o. I'll ask this: what happened to Anyang' Nyong'o, the leftist or the Marxist? Have they been captured by the state? And if they've been captured by the state, what has that got to do with social change? Karl Marx was simply against utopian socialism. And his argument was that, let us move away from what was being propagated by people like Saint-Simon. It was too abstract. Let us focus on reality. And in Kenya, unfortunately, all of us have this hustler mentality. Today I may be poor. Today I may be earning almost nothingness. But I'm living in hope that tomorrow things will be different. And it is based on that you find the crowd always cheers the leader, because at the end of the day, they want to be like the leader. And there is always that probability, underscore that word probability, that this change may bring money into my pocket.
Dr. George, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I'll stick to it. This change may bring money to my pocket. This change is not ideological. This change is all about economics. But unfortunately, because of that fluid social mobility, you will find the people, the crowd, not playing the part that they are supposed to play. So if you want any form of change, look at history and then come up with your own solutions to how this social change can occur in Kenya without looking at the so-called role models, because the state has already captured them, because the state has already dismissed the crowd, because the crowd do not have that spirit, the Geist, what the Germans refer to as the Geist, that may propel the country to greater heights. And that is why at the end of the day, in summary, we are so corrupt. And to summarize, why are we corrupt? If the city is corrupt, the individual will be corrupt, to borrow what Plato said. And if the individual is corrupt, the city is also corrupt. So where will change come from? Personally, as Owoche, I do not know. It will not come from the ground. It will not come from our leaders. So look for a solution elsewhere, and I leave it there, Bwana Moderator. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Uche, for your reactions to Kathleen's paper and Chris's paper. There are a couple of questions I'll raise. There seem to be questions for Professor Katumanga. There aren't questions for Kathleen. So there are two. Professor Katumanga, at the onset, you alluded to factors in impinging on the Marxist trajectory on which the department was grounded as encapsulating convergencies and existing perspectives. Based on this, could we diagnose the waning vehemence of political scientists, scholars, criticisms of the ills in the state to the exit of the arc of dyed-in-the-wool leftists such as Professor Anyang' Nyong'o? Right? Is also asking, what is the commitment of ASU political science scholars currently steeped in active electoral politics to bridging the gap between theory and praxis? The second one is again from Odemba Kefa. I think the last bit of the question is saying there seem to be an ambivalence of political science scholars blaming, there's an ambivalence in political scientists in the manner in which they are dealing with the state. And that perhaps you can comment, he says it has led to the plummeting Marxist radicalism. Maybe you can address to that, to those two or three questions from Kefa Odemba. Professor Katumanga.
Okay. Very nice questions. And I, first of all, want to thank my colleagues, Professor Nying'oro and Kaninga, for their inputs in my appreciations of a number of these issues. And of course, my good friend, Dr. Owoche. For starts, I need to point out, rather re-emphasize what I'd mentioned, that at one point, especially after the hopes and despairs that emerged from 1990s to the period of 2005, you see a shift in terms of analysis. And part of them is basically borrowing from Gramsci and others, the basic appreciation here that the dynamics and change in the society will not necessarily be a function of the Marxist perspective with respect to modes of production, in other words, the base itself, but that there is a very huge phenomena that the superstructure does in terms of contributing. And this is what Uwoche is basically pointing up to. And that is where the major challenge comes in, and I alluded to the whole aspect of what we call, what then comes up in Gramsci's thinking with respect to what he calls the historical block. And so when the modes of production in society, especially when the dominant ideas of the faction that controls power in a epiphenomenal sense converge with its ability to manufacture latent forms of ideological constructions at a superstructural level, then the whole notions of all these ethnic orientations and the shift towards illusory ways of constructing and maintaining political power begin to come in. And that is where the challenge lies. And the Gramscian response to that is essentially the task of all of us, Owoche included. One, in terms of how then this struggle for change shifts from basically that aspect of the modes of production to ideologies, especially at the level of what you're calling the alternative hegemonic ideology that can be constructed, number one, to debunk, and number two, to demystify all these kinds of fairy tales that then capture the society in the name of what you're calling ethnic or basically predatory tendencies or orientations you tend to find within the society itself. So one thing that happens, of course, is the critical perspectives and new forms of what you call constructivist ideas that many political scientists begin to have. And the whole notion of change takes different types of dimensions. In fact, responding to Kefa's questions here, what you notice is that they will produce a wide range of books, from Wanyande's book on transitions to one of the most interesting books on electoral transition, I mean, on electoral issues, gaps and gains in democratic process by Kanyinga, tensions and reversals. You will find the same in what Gona and others will produce in terms of remembering Kenya. Among the key issues that are being looked at here are basically that aspect of how pluralism, or the so-called opening up of associational spaces, is in fact, in one way or another, increasingly made illiberal in terms of wide ranges of tendencies, from ethnic identities to political conflicts, violence, impunity. You're looking at all aspects of reconstitution of what you're calling imperial presidencies and the recentralization, election theft, and the implications of all these. So at the end of it all, you begin seeing the necessity to look at aspects of types of institutions, institutional actors, and eventually what you'll see coming up in a volume Tai Ngunya and others produce on what you call the monopoly, from monopoly to oligopoly of violence, all these leading us to a basic appreciation that a state itself is in a very serious crisis. What are you calling the crisis of a state? So how then do you begin to reconstitute this state to make it viable? And whether that viability will come about as a result of regional integration, or whether that viability will come about perhaps with all forms of violence from below. And this is what our colleagues in IDS, in the volume that is soon to come out on social movements, begins to essentially then address. But even within those kind of contexts, of course, Owoche has a point. The aspect of the material conditions themselves and the challenge within the society itself in terms of the basic notion that everybody has some kind of an expertise in some area, results basically back to what Plato is talking about with respect to the allegory of the cave and the challenge of the political scientist here, which is essentially what? Whether he'll still have the capacity, despite the ridicule that comes out of there, despite the attempts by the society itself and the leadership in all aspects, to make his life much more difficult in terms of what? Sustenance, self-survival. But of interest is the fact that the mission of a political scientist can either be derived from the society or can be self-derived, so that the harder the conditions they find themselves in, the more they have that capacity of trying to grapple with that fundamental question of how society should be managed, should be transformed as not just an idea, but as an empirical kind of a process. The process of why itself may result in most cases to the behavior of political scientists. They are by nature conspiratorial, except at a point at which they are forced to come out. And when they do, they always have two options. And Owoche is right on that point. In most cases, they will proffer to you three options here. The first option is the most critical one, which means commit your necessary class suicide and be ready to do whatever it takes, either freedom, or in other words, live for a purpose, or die for some meaningful thing. That's one. The flip side of it, they will tell you, let's try to tamper with what you're calling the institutions, so that they fit, at least for a short period of time, over time in space, to bring about some contradictions that will push the argument another notch higher, what you call the dialectics themselves. The third bit of it, which in most cases they do not necessarily advocate for, but becomes a given, is to basically stay and let society collapse from within, which then allows those conditions within which the argument is pushed much further by the very basic fact that people are now in a position to begin looking at other alternatives other than what they essentially have. So briefly, they have not abdicated that responsibility. They are still there, only that they have taken different kinds of forms given the nature of the society itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe, Kitmanga, you may come back to this, but this is both my question to both of you, Dr. Nangwe and Professor Katumanga. Why do we think that the cheering crowd or the mob, as Dr. Owoche has pointed out. Why do we think that they do not have an ideology, and this, for them to act, there should be somebody somewhere, a political scientist, a sociologist, why do we think these people don't have an ideology? That it's as if they do not know what they want. I think there's societies in the world where people have organized themselves away from this, grandiose ideas from sociology, political science, historians, etc., and they have succeeded. The Bougainvilleans in Western Papua Guinea and other places. So why do we think that the crowd, so to speak, or the cheering crowd, or the mob, to use which is a word, do not have an idea of what, or an ideology, to propel themselves and bring change?
May I jump in before Chris responds, if he would want to? I think your question is really interesting. Interesting in the sense that it's making me almost smile in my corner. One, I look at the work, to respond to you, I look at the work of Theda Skocpol, who is writing about revolutions. And Theda says that from her prediction, the next revolutions will start at the top, which speaks to the fact that the crowd so far over time in history cannot deliver much. Why? Because the crowd needs a leader to coalesce around. They may have ideas, but their ideas, if left alone to roll out, will end up going in different directions because of various competing interests. Because remember, as a crowd, we may have an ethos which is keeping us together, but our concerns or our interests begin to race or run ahead of us. And that, of course, will lead to a disintegration somewhere. Remember, I said they dissipate. So even if we have the hustler mentality that is keeping us together, to borrow the words of Owoche, and it's keeping us together and is seeming to drive us towards one end, after a while, some hustlers will begin to feel more hustler than others. And at the end of it, there will be nothing to show for the whole effort. So they have to coalesce around a leader of some sort, a leader giving them either illusions that I can deliver for you, because they discover that later on, that they're still cheering, the leader is gone with the goods, and they're trying to find the leader and they're not finding him. So the crowd still provides us with a lot of interesting analysis that we can use to reflect on ourselves and what it was we were looking for in the first place. So in political science, I don't know if they see it differently and they think the crowd can deliver in a sense in terms of causing social change. But in sociology, we're a little bit apprehensive about the capabilities of the crowd to getting that kind of outcome, a gated outcome, so to speak. Perhaps we need to add another dimension to our studies. But so far in collective behavior and social movements, the movements seem to be, driving an agenda, but the agenda falls flat on its face halfway. And here, I'm just giving examples, not really deferring to ethnicity or deferring to social movements that are current, that also are turning out to be different. Look at our use of technology, the mobile phone. And now with the youngsters using TikTok, and they're driving agendas of change. But can we call that a crowd? A virtual crowd maybe, but it may not achieve the same kinds of impetus that a physical crowd would, which is what we are usually used to. So maybe we have to change the way we're looking at things. But in terms of, whether it's still cheering, yeah, it's still cheering, and the dimensions, the goals are always shifting. That's the exciting thing about it. George, to that extent, I beg to differ and say that the cheering crowd can't deliver. It just cheers.
Professor Katumanga, yes.
It's a very interesting discussion. Of course, when Owoche talks about the cheering crowd, I guess that is what Catherine is Kathleen is alluding to, we are not trying to say that the cheering crowd does not have, in most cases, ideas about their conditions, the existential conditions themselves. There's an aspect of that consciousness and what have you. But the fundamental question of why they are the way they are and what needs to be done in terms of the relations between power relations and the structures in the society, how they are organized, the lethality of the violence that is available or mobilized against them is what is the issue here. And that is in the realm of what you call what? Essentially, when you look at the what causation we look at, a clause you should look at in terms of what we call war. So there's one way of looking at war as politics by other means. And there's another way of looking at politics themselves, in fact, as war by other means. And in this case, you're talking about modes and methods, including violence that will be used by a dominant elite holding political power to keep certain classes or certain groups where they belong, including that aspect of what types of ideologies will be peddled out there that people then begin to reflect, thinking is their original or they are spontaneous about an action that is happening. I will use one very small cryptic example that happened when a bunch of elites, especially, of intellectuals through IPA sought to help a large number of elites, especially of opposition, in what became known as the 4Cs and then eventually the T. And so in the second convention, there is this meeting that is taking place in Ufungamano at exactly around 10 o'clock in the night. The issue of whether to transform that convention into a sovereign national conference came up. Everybody in the hall got excited about the whole idea. And there were all many people who were willing to march, including to the State House if need be. So the Trotskyite, Apollo Njonjo, rose up to ask a question, whether everybody understood what a sovereign conference meant. And he gave a very nice illustration. It means we march right now and go and occupy Harambee House. And in so doing, we must also be preparing ourselves about what other institutions of government we want to capture. And it's going to involve sacrificing our lives. Are you ready? Of course, a number of actors, especially both, direction where they wanted to go. But they had brought within themselves a bunch of other guys whose interest was not in that kind of a direction. And that is where now the radical framework of what transformation of a state was supposed to take place actually came to an end. And the result out of it was the IPPG, and the rest of it is essentially history. So the point line of all this is that if you are talking about an idea, it has to be accompanied. An idea has to be transformed into an objective. That is the end state. It has to be accompanied by the process of what? The applications of means to achieve that particular end. And that process of applying means to achieve that particular end is the whole role function of what you call the leadership, to try and look at all these dynamics of basically what you're calling the government itself and the decision makers with respect to whether you want to choose war as an option, or, and in this case, the second element of it, the second leg, which has to do with the means you're going to use, whether you're going to use violence and what type of violence and what end that violence is supposed to serve, which is essentially what you're calling organized violence. Are the people. Who are these people? These people, you're talking about passions, you're talking about hatred and what have you. And in Ibsen's book, The Enemy of the People, what ends up happening is a classic example of what is happening in the US. A man who can engender collapse of a society through mismanagement of a pandemic, being able to control half of the population. In other words, that is willing to re-elect him. Those are the fellows you're calling the people. A larger part of the time, they may not necessarily understand who the oppressor is until it's completely late. And that is why they have.
Thank you. Thanks, Fred. I was just last one. I was wondering how Ngugi was able to mobilize the people of Kamiritu. Maybe that is something that we, as we go home, we can think about with regard to what Kathleen has said and what you have just said. Maybe not to respond. We'll go straight to have Dr. Mbongi to speak on the history of history, reflections of the historiographical trends in historical study at University of Nairobi. Again, I want to ask for your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen. This has extended beyond the scheduled time, but bear with us because we started late. We will not take this beyond 6 o'clock, right? We won't take this beyond 6 o'clock. So Dr. Mbongi, you have 15, 17 minutes, and Margaret, Dr. Gachi will give you 7 minutes, and then we will open the discussion. Kindly do the same. Write your questions at the chat section. Thank you. Dr. Mbongi, please, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Gona, and I hope everybody is hearing me. I want to appreciate first and foremost our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Dr. Gengo. I saw him up to some time ago. I think he's either still in or he left a moment ago. Our Dean, Professor Wahome, and our colleagues, Dr. Wangala, Ms. Adima, Musambai, and Anangwe. In fact, they have very ably brought in the subject that we aim to cover very well. And Musambai says the rest is history, and now we are dealing with that history, I think. My presentation, as Dr. Gona has indicated, is the history of history. Some reflections, of course, and I want to do 4 things to make my point. First is what I'm calling a preamble, where I will answer the question, what am I saying in this presentation? 2, I'll give some small background about the Department of History, highlighting salient tenets which I think define the history of history department. And then I will briefly look at the scholarship trajectories in the department and dialectics therein, and make some conclusions. So those 4 will be good enough. Now, what am I saying, friends? In this presentation, I'm of the view that fundamentally and invariably, the history of the history department essentially has been an interesting microcosm or miniature of Kenya's society and development generally. In some sense, I'm saying that the history of the department is so intertwined with Kenya's attempts at nationhood, to the extent that this study becomes an important glimpse into the dynamics and contradictions that formed, or I should say, misformed modern Kenya. So the question some people might ask is, you know, what is so novel about this? You know, some would argue that it's only natural for either a university or a discipline within it to develop in tandem with aspirations and needs and interests of the wider society. But friends, it appears to me that historians in Nairobi went beyond that call of duty. They jostled for actual space and real influence both in the marketplace of ideas as well as society, and essentially became part and parcel of both worlds, the academy and the society. Some of them, I should think, very strategically straddled between the two worlds. That brings me to the small background that I wanted to give. And I want to look at it from, the very interesting contradictions that, came with this department and seem to have defined it over the years. History at the University of Nairobi was actually a pioneer department. With English, geography, and mathematics, it constituted the Faculty of Arts founded in 1965 as part of the newly formed Royal Technical College, Nairobi. But when you look generally and cross-sectionally, in those initial years, what really made the Department of History important and noticeable within the fraternity of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences specifically, and the university in general, was really not so much this pioneering status, but the contradictions, the interesting series of paradoxes which characterized its early history and the contribution to scholarship. First, and very quickly, let me look at the contradictions in its history, and then I will delve slightly later into the contradictions in scholarship that went within the Department of History. It's history. First, history was a humanity, a liberal art, in fact. But it was entrenched in what was initially thought from its inception as the Royal Technical College. In a sense, then, it became an art within a technical college. And by the way, it was in those initial days offered to students of A level, not at university level. It was offered by the department to students of A level. And it came about at the height of the political unrest following the Mau Mau War. And out of this, there was this sense that Africans had to be expediently socialized within the framework of the political economy of the late colonial period. And therefore, it became necessary, to educate the so-called, in quotes, primitives in civilization. The beauty and the majesty of the British Empire and the great British tradition. We talked about this with Michael from the discussion of my colleagues. So when you look at it broadly, then the Royal Technical College was essentially part of the latter-day colonial tokenism, which sought to keep Africans' education and training within the colonial framework of manual status, or what sociologists could call blue-collar jobs, which were thought to be the forte of Africans then. And it is in that context that history was thought to be an important socializing agent in producing these technical guys. And therefore, it actually came earlier, much earlier than political science, sociology, and literature, which, in a manner of speaking, were young children of the late 60s and 70s compared to history, if such a personification is permitted. In that sense, then, we see a paradox. History was an art that became, quote unquote, a science, because in producing technical staff, people would do basically low cadre jobs, and that was the thinking at first. If they were teachers, they were teachers. They would be teachers at the lower levels. It became a science in that sense, to socialize, to shape the African. That was the first one. The second one, and this is very interesting, is the paradox of a department of diplomats that did not train diplomats or diplomacy. You know, if you look generally, and I have notes all my table here, you know, the Department of History produced rather disproportionately a very high number of diplomats for the country and occupants of senior civil service positions from rank and file of its lecturers. This was much more even when the university had a department or a sub-department of international relations within political science, and later became the Institute of Diplomacy and International Relations. I mean, starting from Dr. Karanja, the first Vice Chancellor, who was Kenya's ambassador in London, Dr. Kip Koril, a member of staff, later moved on and served as an ambassador in the US. The former chairman of this department, Professor Ida Salim, who served in Amsterdam, Dr. Yusuf Zubo, who served in Amsterdam and then US later, Dr. Sally Kosgei, who served in London. I can actually go on and on. I mean, what is interesting, and this is the question I'm asking, is this tendency by historians to leave teaching and writing and get into the realm of making history as technocrats by extending their influence beyond the corridors of the Department of History is quite interesting, and what explains it. It is possible that historians are socialized in ways that make them understand complex issues of international relations. Maybe it also bespeaks of historians' ability to diversify, you know, for both expedient reasons of survival and community service, which created another paradox that you find common, not just in the University of Nairobi, but in other universities in Africa. The idea of a brain drain, you know, and those who go out the civil service or go out abroad, and then those who remain because of lack of facilities and infrastructure. We have what I regard as drained brains. That's the paradox of brain drain and brain drains. But the more plausible explanation of this is that historians from the department, in a sense, became culprits and victims of the patron-client paradigm, which created the patrimonial state that Kenya largely became. On one side, they were actually Combrado elite class, who became the architects of what Professor Kanyinga, and I saw him here earlier, called the other day Project Kenya. Yeah. On the other side, you know, they you know, at least severed the vagaries of state sanctioned ethnicized politics. You know, but then they were able to balance this through the process of collaboration and co-option, which patron-client states use. And my colleagues from political science can speak to this much better than I can do. And therefore, we have this interesting history of a department that has produced diplomats, but we don't train any. Then the other one is something that I consider important, and as I finish this subsection, is that whereas history was being used as a tool of socializing the African, the primitive Africans, African in quote, you know, it in a sense, the department excluded the single most important agents of citizen socialization, women, and it became a citadel of patriarchy. There were hardly women there. You know, you look through up to about the 80s when things began to change. You know, at the core of the colonial matrix of citizen socialization, in the domestic sphere particularly, there were women as mothers, as homemakers and caregivers, you know. While then they were significant in the domestic sphere, in the academic marketplace, where citizens were socialized and history was important, women were disallowed. Very interesting. It was the case in the Department of History, and this will interest our colleagues who look at gender. In those initial years, history in our university was a men's affair. There were hardly any women among the academics, neither were there among students. I have spent the last week gleaning through the University of Nairobi annual reports, but there were very few women in the academy. You know, earlier on, you find one lady, an archaeologist, expatriate archaeologist, Dr. Sandra. Then later on, joined the Princeton-trained Dr. Sally Kosgei. And later on, the Dalhousie-trained Milka Jola in the 70s and the 80s. The same case with students. I have gone through some annual reports and issues of the Historical Association of Kenya journal. They reveal the lonely presence of very few girls in the corridors of the department as students. You know, Florida Karan, for example, I think sometime in the 60s, and then Kapita Kanogo in the 70s, who actually stood out as the only African girls in the corridors of the history department. So much for that. You know, these paradoxes in the department were not confined to these key tenets of its history. They also touched in the scholarship that went on in this department. The first one, very quickly, is what I see as a trend, a conceptual trend.
Dr. Mbongi, you have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I will need about 5 to finish this.
No. We don't want to go beyond that.
Okay. All right, so let me finish this too. The nationalist historiography that was more tribalizing than nationalizing. You know, after independence, there was a wave taking place in Europe among the Africanists, and the recognition that Africa finally had a history. This was taken up very quickly by the initial academics of the Department of History and Archaeology. And this led to very interesting publications of what I regard as ethnic histories. You know, the work of Professor Gott on the Luo is known, Professor Wele on the Luya, Professor Murioki on the Kikuyu, Professor Mwansi on the Kepsiks and the rest. But interesting thing about these works, and I'm finishing when I convener, is one, they de-emphasize the hybrid nature of Kenyan communities, but overemphasize the separateness that we have, how separated we are. That way, they created a strong ethnic subnationalism, which has competed very, very interestingly with the ideals of nationhood today. Two, it is emphasized conflict and cooperation that I see appearing in the critical junctures of intercommunity relations, but overemphasize conflicts themselves. You know, and number three, they de-emphasized accumulation and aggrandizement in traditional settings in spaces overly dominated by patriarchy And finally, it emphasized continuities of traditional structures and systems with a very brazen focus on lexical labels such as traditional, pre-colonial, indigenous, etc. And the effect of this is that it provided fodder for ethnic Chauvinists among the political class to entrench the idea of us and them. This is what dominated the department. But then, because of this over-concentration on the nationalist narrative, the opened room for the emergence of a rival thinking and style of conceptualizing history, which was more leftist, which was more Marxist. But the paradox that came with this is that when you look at the mid-70s onwards, the Marxists, and I'm finishing, Dr. Gona, came up with an interesting argument talking about really dismissing the nationalist historians as bourgeois historians who ventured safely in documentary kind of history, documenting the past and events, which was a safe ground to tread. And they started talking about history with a cause, not history for the sake of it. History with a cause, for them, it was class struggle that will lead to the liberation of quote-unquote lumpens from state autocracy and create this utopian stateless society. There were, and my colleagues referred to this, but in history, we had people like Otieno Diambo, Maina Wakinyati, Benjamin Koril, and many others who took this strand. But what was important, and this is my last point, Dr. Gona, is that, you see, as we approached the 80s and the 90s, it became very clear that if these many leftists within the department were really leftists, they were leftists without socialism in a sense. And that is the paradox that I'm talking about. Because at the end of the 80s, early 90s, there was only one standing leftist in the department, and that was Otieno Diambo just before he left to the US. The others collaborated and were co-opted by the Moi state, and others straddled between academia and the state in order to find a safe ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Mbongi, for your presentation. That's a good summary of the historiographical trends in the department. Could we hear Dr. Margaret Gachihi to react to Dr. Mbongi's presentation? Over to you, Dr. Gachihi.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I don't know whether it's an advantage or you are totally disadvantaged coming at the tail end of a webinar like this one. Maybe it's an advantage whereby I can say all the work has been done for me. And if I thanked our presenters this evening and left it at that, I think I'll have done something in this meeting tonight. But it was very fascinating indeed. And I would like to thank our presenters for very insightful presentations. I was especially impressed by our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Ogendo, for speaking very profoundly like a true historian. That's amazing, just the kind of grasp that he has on issues that are close to the heart of historians. But then again, I quickly also remembered that we are all historians, virtually all of us. All those who have presented are historians. And looking at what they have told us this evening, the work speaks for itself. It's an attestation that we are historians. Now, why is this? Inasmuch as we all hold opinions of the past, and those opinions influence our actions, our everyday behavior, and I would like to quote Stanford here in his work, History, a companion to the study of history, whereby he says, and I quote, that being well informed about the past is not only a right, but a duty. It's not only a right, but a duty. And I can say our presentations tonight really again reflected that. Scholars who are informed, not just about what is going on in the contemporary world, but about the past. Now, I don't know what one can say in 3 minutes, 5 minutes, but I think Dr. Obongi has teased out the nuggets in the historiographical trends and trajectories in regard to the department in the last 5 decades or so. There. Just to add that it has been, and it was always, a very colorful department, full of action, so to speak, sometimes physical action. And like Obongi has noted, it has straddled not just academia, but society. And we ask why? What is it in the history department that enables that kind of interface between scholarship and life, if I may call it that, life? I remember people like Atieno Odhiambo, who very excitedly would come with topics as students who are so astonished. He would write a paper on the history of Rumba, for example, and we are like, what? What is the professor talking about, right? So there's no lack of action. There has been no lack of action in the department. Our trade is history. Our trade is history. And history we regard it as the experience of life extended over time. It's the experience of life extended over time. And therefore, we are able to talk about trajectories, we talk about movements, we talk about lessons learned, and this is what my colleague Ken, Dr. Obongi, has been talking about. I would put his presentation in what we call historical historiography. He was more interested in historical historiography. And this journal is more domiciled as a tool of writing history. We can talk about, for example, historiography. We can talk about descriptive historiography, dealing with methodology. We can talk about analytical historiography that deals with the concepts of history. My point is this, that it doesn't matter the genre of historiography you are dealing with. The bottom line is this, and we need to ask this, we need to ask ourselves this tonight. Does it help us? Does it help us in modern terms and standards to assess the historical value of the historical work that is presented to us? So we look at the historiography and we assess its worth in regard to the value that it imbues us to be able to assess the value of that historical work. And when we talk about departments like ours, because I'm an historian, I'm domiciled in the history department, We are also talking about individuals populating that space. So we need not just think of departments as a corpus of individuals. Sometimes we need to chambua the individuals and look at the individual contributions as individual historians and ask ourselves, what intellectual influences helped shape their perspectives? What shaped Muriuki's perspective? What shaped Ogod's perspective? What shapes Atieno Odhiambo, Mukaru Ng'ang'a, Mwangi wa Githumo, may God rest his soul in peace, and all the others? And then ask ourselves, as the current crop in the department, what is shaping our thinking? What are the influences that are pertinent to the histories that we are producing today as members of the historical history department? So we are looking into the past, but I would also like to say we also have an eye to the future. We talk about our great predecessors and we mention them by name, the great historians by name. But I'm also saying we need to cast an eye to the future in our modern dispensation to think about our collective and individual legacy for the history department. Just like the VC said, it's not just 50 years ago, it's also about 50 years later. What are we going to leave behind? I know we don't have time, but when you're looking back for 50 years, I often think that you can do this quickly by breaking down into broad phases of the historiographic trends. I'll not go into them, but one, you can look at the birthing of African history, the giving birth of African history as a fully fledged academic discipline, as a legitimate field of historical inquiry. It may seem obvious, especially to our colleagues, but for history, it was not always obvious, right? And therefore we thank a pioneering corpus of scholars, the pre-independence, the pre and post-independence scholars who are able to push back the thesis of men like Wilhelm Heigl, who declared that Africa is no historical part of the world. So our mandates are always different. Our issues are different today. And we need to thank those who have gone before us because they were tasked with such tasks that we today take for granted. So the Muriukis, the Ogots, the Mwanzis, and all the others are very important to the story of scholarship in the University of Nairobi, in the departments, fighting against colonial distortions, racism, and also the question of historical sources, the validity of historical sources. Today we take it for granted. But it's not until very long ago that African historians could write the histories of their societies because no one accepted that the sources they used were valid. And no wonder we have all these emerging themes at the beginning of the new state, of the post-colonial states. Histories of pre-colonial African societies, histories of migrations that Atieno Odhiambo sometimes in his wry humor would ask, why are African societies and communities walking up and down the plains, sometimes stopping for 100 years because they cannot cross a river, they cannot cross a lake? I think he was making some point there about the kind of histories that we had at that particular time. We also take note of
2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, Margaret.
We also take note of the critiques of other scholars who thought that there was emphasis, for example, of history of nationalisms at the expense of other crucial histories in the post-independent state. For example, had enough attention been paid to the contradiction of the colonial project? Where was the social history? Where was gender? Where was class differentiation and its import on the post-colonial state? And of course, these birthed theories in underdevelopment, dependency theories, the excitement with Rodney, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, Colin Leys and his views of underdevelopment. Therefore, without much time, just like to appreciate, as Ken intimated, that we have also new historiography in the 1980s and the 1980s that engages more in such areas as women history in relation to the state. We see more of intellectual history again in the 1980s and the 1990s. And very importantly, we are able to see discourses, George, I'm thinking of you, discourses that are grounded in local narratives, right? I think this is very, very important in making an interface between the ivory tower and what is going on in the ground. And I finish by asking these questions. One, is it true, as some have intimated, that African historiography suffers from alienation and displacement? Two, who controls the production of African history? To what extent have Western scholars driven the agendas of African history? Three, are we sufficiently engaged with the current reality as historians? What are we writing about? How are we engaging with society and topical issues? We need to sometimes stop talking about migrations and stuff, right? So that we are relevant to our contemporary societies and that we can be drivers of development in our societies. Fourthly, what methodologies are we using? Are there adequate methodologies? Have we moved in regard to methodologies and conceptual capacities so that we can advance the historic agendas of African historiography currently in the present dispensation? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Gachi, for your clearly stated response. The last questions, I'll give Dr. Mbongi only 2 minutes. I said we'll stop at 6. We have gone beyond 6. It's unfair to our participants. And I would like to give Dr. Mbongi 2 minutes to react to the questions only. You can just pick specific ones. Some of them were more or less like comments. Dr. Mbongi.
Thank you, Dr. Gona. Thank you so much. Thanks, Maggie, for that very nice, interesting view of what I was saying. Very quickly, you see the question of moving away from ethnic histories, migration and settlement narratives started in the department in about mid 70s. When the leftists started questioning the thinking and arguing that, that there was an element of visualization of history that had crept into the department. In fact, I remember a paper that was published, I think it was by Professor Semil Vici, where he seemed to suggest that whereas we have over-concentrated on migration and settlement, it is not necessarily people who are moving at the epoch or periods of pre-colonial history. It is ideas of iron technology, ideas of cultural exchange, ideas of crafts that moved more than people. And these brought people together more than the constant moving that has been presented as the rational mechanism, the only rational mechanism that Africans had in coping with environmental vagaries. That is first. Second, I like your idea of the politics of the production of historical knowledge. It's obvious that we still continue the relationship of the slave and the master that informed the colonial political economy of knowledge creation, where Nairobi will always look up to London. That has not died. You find that what we have is the global north controlling what the global south thinks and produces. That is critical. This partly has come because of our systemic challenges, which has made independent thinking a little bit more difficult in the South than in the North. Of course, there is an angle that touches on, economics of infrastructure and finances and all that. But the fact is that if you see historical knowledge, it is predominantly belonging to global north. We respond, most of the time we have been reactionary to what we see and get from the global north because they control the money, they control the infrastructure and many other things. Perhaps we need to have the new debates of the emerging dependence in the politics of the production of historical knowledge. You see, I'm finishing, Dr. Gona. You see, there's still the elements of what we had in the 60s, of everybody in the department looking up to where they were trained. The arguments between the American trained and the British trained, who went where emerges, and the thinking that you have. You remember what Dr. Alex Wanjala said about the overwhelming influence of what in the 60s was being called the elite school in the thinking of literature. For a long time, London controlled what happened in our departments. When they talked about ethnic histories, we went to ethnic histories. When things of class struggle became vogue and they were driven by Professor Hobsbawm, we went Marxist. When issues of the touch on, the moral economies, we went there. So the thing is, we need to begin to have a new conversation on the politics of knowledge production and the divide between the global north and the global south.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mbogi, for that reaction. I would not want to extend this webinar. I would want to, first of all, on my own behalf and on behalf of the department, and the chair of the department, Dr. Kenneth Umbongi, and on behalf of the senior administration of the University of Nairobi, to thank you very much for finding time to join us in this webinar. Again, we should have started earlier, but there were hitches, there were confusion, but we are glad at least that was resolved. Apologies to friends who tried to join, they couldn't because of one reason or another. I hope next time we have such an occasion, we'll counter check our links and arrangements so that then we don't have the hitches that we have today. So I would want to really thank you very much. For the panelists, for the discussants, you were able to respond at a very short notice, and that is the spirit we want to have at the University of Nairobi, and especially in the Faculty of Arts. That is the way we want to go. The interdisciplinary approach we have given this webinar is really welcome. I appreciate it myself, and I would want to really appreciate that from my bottom of my heart, that this has been wonderful to have the colleagues, and, students and all and everybody else from all over the world to join us. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The seminars or the webinars, sorry, continue. We'll have two more webinars, one on philanthropy, which we're beginning to organize. We'll have, philanthropists and donors who would want to speak to us. And then we'll have one, last one on social movements towards a graduation time. I hope we can squeeze that before we go for graduation and take a break from this hectic year that we have had. Again, thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gonda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you
bye.
for those who joined us, Madam
you,
Anna
Ghana.
Dima, who joined, and those who joined us from abroad.
Thank you guys. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Kathleen.
As the hosts, we will leave last.
And I'm sure you can sleep tonight, Ken.
Yes, it has been a bit hectic, but manageable.
Yes, that has been a good talk, Ken.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Professor Wahome.
Yes, thank you, Prof, for being there.
I didn't know you are still in the house.
Yes, Prof has been here all along.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes. So see you guys tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Okay, Prof.
Remember, you'll be speaking next on the faculty, so we can't let you go on that one.
I'm still thinking about it. It is very close to come, so I'll think about it. I'll let you know.
You think about it. It's coming up towards the end of this month.
Okay, I'll tell you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I leave now.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paula Temba. Thank you for being with us. Rolene, thank you so much. Brother Franklin Sewe, thank you for being there. We have Judy here and many others. Mr. Masika, thank you.